As Director of Training at LITB, Cynthia designs and delivers transformative programs that empower individuals and teams to implement CPS principles effectively. A sought-after speaker and consultant, she inspires diverse audiences and guides them toward collaborative problem solving. Cynthia's unwavering dedication to improving the lives of children and adolescents drives innovation and positive change at LITB, creating a brighter future for generations to come. Welcome, Cynthia.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. So thank you all for being here today. So today's topic is very close to my heart. We're going to talk about enhancing school safety through an essential shift in our approach. Instead of relying on traditional timeout rooms, we are here to explore the transformative power of embracing the collaborative and proactive solutions model, the CPS model. In the next hour, we're going to dig into why timeout rooms are not the best, and how can we switch things up with collaborative and proactive solutions to keep everyone safe and happy, kids and adults alike. Now, you might be wondering, the collaborative and proactive solutions model. Well, the CPS model is the brainchild of Dr. Ross Greene, a true pioneer in understanding and supporting kids with behavioral issues. His journey started with a fierce belief in every child's worth and potential. And after years and years of research and hands-on experience, he came up with this game-changing approach. But here's the thing. Collaborative and proactive solution isn't just some dry theory. CPS is all about compassion, evidence, trauma awareness, and embracing different cultures. And Dr. Greene's organization, Lives in the Balance, along with our work with schools and districts, is all about connecting on a real human level. We're more than just an organization. We are known all around the globe, not only for our professionalism and effectiveness, but also for the personal connections we foster with every school and teacher we support. So, what can you expect from me today outside of my big, chunky French accent? I'm wondering how the interpreters are going to translate big, chunky French accent. Oh, I just saw it. Wonderful. So basically, I'm going to give you the highlights of the CPS model, and together, let's make a difference. Okay, let's dive in. Let's start this. So as the director of trainings at Lives in the Balance, I have had the privilege of supporting numerous organizations in their journey away from traditional power dynamics towards collaboration and problem solving. So let me start by saying that balancing the demands of work while raising 4 lively kids has given me firsthand insight into the challenges both educators and parents face. I empathize deeply because I've been there myself. With my own children, I have experienced the struggles firsthand, whether it was with my oldest testing boundaries or my third one navigating his emotions. Each of my children has presented unique challenges. And just when we thought we had a moment to breathe, along came another bundle of joy, number 4, bringing new parenting adventures. So that's why I'm incredibly passionate about shifting away from punitive approaches like timeout rooms and moving towards collaboration and problem solving. I believe in teaching our children to work collaboratively together to solve problems rather than asserting power over them. And I understand the difficulties educators face in managing challenging behaviors in schools. it can be really overwhelming, and the temptation to resort to punishment is understandable. But our aim is to reduce as much as possible situations where punitive measures are necessary. Transitioning away from crisis management towards collaboration and problem solving may seem daunting for some people, but it is achievable. Schools all over the world in diverse communities and with students of all ages have successfully made this shift. So efforts invested in supporting children's well-being are always worth it. So I'm here today to guide you in understanding where those efforts can be most impactful in helping children who may be struggling sometimes. So before we dive into the technical details, I want you to start thinking about a kid with whom you're working, or maybe a kid with whom you're living. Maybe a kid like Jake, meet Jake. I know it's not his best picture, but meet Jake. He is a 13 years old boy who brings endless energy to our school. You could see him doing some TikTok dances, snacking all the time. He's loving pizza, of course, napping whenever he can, and chatting with his friends with a one-syllable, words, those kind of words that just adolescent can understand. I'm sure that there are some Jakes in your building too, right? So Jake's got an infectious energy that lights up any room. But like many kids his age, he struggles with handling his emotions when things don't go his way. When he faces a problem, his reactions can be really intense. He might get loud, he might throw things, he might push back against authority. His emotions are far from being subtle. Despite the best efforts of the adults around him, Jake's outbursts often need to be addressed. Previously, staff used quick fixes like sending Jake to a timeout room or using sometimes even physical restraint. But these only tackled the surface issue, not the root cause. Even proactive attempts like sending Jake to the timeout room earlier often fell into the same reactive cycle. These measures only addressed the symptoms, not the underlying problems. So to truly help Jake, we need to understand what's causing his difficulties. This is where the CPS model, the collaborative and proactive solutions model, stands out. Unlike other models that react to behaviors, CPS focused on solving problems proactively and collaboratively. Decades of research on kids like Jake show they struggle with behaviors because they sometimes have difficulty accessing crucial skills such as frustration tolerance, emotion regulation, flexibility, adaptability, and problem solving. If you're good with these skills and life is putting you in a context in which you need to use these skills, you will be able to behave well. That's not the case of Jake. In the CPS approach, we work with the kid to solve the problems that are affecting their life. Many other methods wait until things get ugly, and then the impulse adult decided solutions. CPS engages the kid in finding solutions so they don't struggle anymore, not solutions on what they're going to do the next time they struggle. So CPS is really the real deal for preventing crisis because it's about as early, as proactive, and as collaborative problem solving that you can be. Remember these two mantras that I'm about to tell you because we will refer to them quite often today. Don't be late and ask the kid. If your interventions are not matching these two mantras, don't count me in. I don't think they will work. Don't be late and ask the kids. Let's transition to another slide that I hope will make this point crystal clear. This graphic depicts the sequence of restraint and seclusion, or what in Massachusetts is called the timeout. So it's the sequence of timeout. You've got 5 bubbles up there, and the colors are meaningful. This is very important. In blue, everything that's early, crisis prevention. In red, everything that's late, crisis management. You don't want to be late. You don't want to be late. You want to be early. You don't want to be in crisis management mode. You want to be in crisis prevention mode. So, what is early? Well, it's figuring out what expectations Jake is having difficulty meeting. What are Jake's blue bubbles? What are Jake's unsolved problems? And solving those problems proactively so that we never find ourselves in the red. And I will discuss today a tool called the ACE, the Assessment of Skills and Unsolved Problems, which is part of the collaborative and proactive solutions model that help us do that effectively. Blue bubble, identifying unsolved problems, unmet expectations. It's about as early as you can get. And if that was what was going on in most schools, there would be virtually no need for timeout rooms. But unfortunately, in many places, this is not what is primarily going on. What is primarily going on still in many schools when a child is having difficulty meeting a particular expectation? What is primarily going on still in Jake's school when he's having difficulty meeting a particular expectation? Well, you know, when Jake struggled to keep his cell phone in his backpack during class time, that's one of his unsolved problems or one of his blue bubbles. What are the typical interventions employed by the school? Red bubble number 1, us, caregivers, insist harder. We push the kid harder, almost adult instinct. By the way, founded on the belief that pushing kid harder to meet expectations we already know they cannot reliably meet elicit better performance. But that hasn't been my experience. That hasn't been Jake's experience. That has not been my experience, that pushing kids harder to meet expectations we already know we cannot reliably meet elicit better performance. Nope. In my experience, doing that elicits behaviors. Okay, let's revisit Jake's situation. Again, Jake consistently faces challenges in keeping his cell phone in his backpack during class time. Again, representing one of his ongoing difficulty or one of his ongoing blue bubbles. Despite encountering this problem often, when Jake uses his phone during class, adults tend to respond by pushing harder on Jake. For instance, they might say, Jake, is the 3rd time I'm reminding you, you must put your cell phone in your backpack or I will remove it from you. And guess what? With Jake too, it elicits behaviors. I don't care about your silly rule. And let's just say that there's a whole bunch of other impolite things Jake might say or do when we push harder on him to meet an expectation we already know he struggles with. Here's the deal. In schools right now, a lot of the stuff we're doing to help kids ends up just being a fancier way of pushing harder. We are trying different approaches with Jake, like talking to Jake over and over again about why this expectation is an important expectation. We even let Jake use his cell phone when he was doing well in class. We are adapting things. We are accommodating things. We try strategic planning with Jake. But here's the kicker. Even though we're doing all this with the best intentions, we are still basically telling Jake, hey, you got to meet these expectations that you struggle with. No excuses. And the thing is, that can sometimes make things worse instead of better, which will bring us into the red bubble number 2. Now, in the collaborative and proactive solutions model, we view that concerning behaviors as the kid's frustration response. Sorry. Concerning behaviors that communicates to us something we already knew. Jake is having difficulty reliably meeting that expectation. We knew that. And I want to make a very important point here. Please notice that the concerning behavior is late. The concerning behavior is late. It's occurring well after Jake has been having difficulty meeting a particular expectation. Interventions that are focused on behaviors are interventions that are focused on what's late. And if the response is a significant outburst of frustrations, it can pose risk and be quite alarming, as what it was when Jake threatened to hurl a chair across the room. Then we adults, based on our crisis prevention training, are going to conclude that Jake is becoming escalated. And what are we going to do next? Red bubble number 3. We are going to deploy one of the things that we were taught to use in our crisis prevention training. We are going to try to de-escalate Jake. But how can that be crisis prevention? You are now very late. If you're very late, it isn't crisis prevention. It's crisis management. And if your de-escalation efforts fail, and they often do because you're late, what have a lot of people been trained to do next? Red bubble number 4, lay hands on the kids, restrain or seclude the kids, or send the kids to a timeout room. And you are now very, very late. And by the way, with the justification that we are keeping kids and caregivers safer by doing that, I'm aware of not one study, not one, providing data telling us that restraining and secluding kids keeps kids and caregivers safer. In my experience, and there are data to support this, that's when kids and caregivers get hurt. So that's the sequence. When you're working with us, you are in the blue bubble. That's what we work on with schools. At a very practical level, here's what we help school staff learn how to do. We teach them to proactively identify the problems that are causing a child's frustration responses with the use of a tool called the ASIP, the Assessment of Skills and Unsolved Problems. And remember this, CPS is the real deal for preventing crisis because it's about as early as you can be. Remember also your 2 mantras. Don't be late and ask the kid. In this graphic, we're talking about don't be late. Stay in the blue bubble. One of my favorite expressions that I use with the staff I work with in schools or in treatment facilities when I'm trying to help them dramatically reduce or eliminate their use of late intervention like timeout rooms is, I'm going to get you out of the heat of the moment. Nothing good happens in the heat of the moment. Let's get you out of the heat of the moment where timeout rooms are happening or where punitive measures are used. Let's get you out of the late interventions. Let's get you out of the red bubbles. Let's get you out of the crisis management measures. Let's help you be proactive early with your interventions. Let's get you in crisis prevention mode, in the blue bubble, proactively, early. And I also often say to them, I hate seeing kids get restrained or secluded or sent to a timeout room over an expectations, we already know this kid has difficulty meeting reliably. I hate seeing kids getting a detention, a suspension, an expulsion, getting hit, arrested over expectations we already know that this kid cannot reliably meet. That's why in this model, our focus is on identifying and addressing the unsolved problems, the blue bubbles, rather than solely reacting to the behavior resulting from those unsolved problems. And as I mentioned earlier, we utilize a tool called the Assessment of Skills and Unsolved Problems, which we teach schools how to use. With the implementation of this instrument in your school, Jakes become very predictable. Adults in your school are no longer finding themselves constantly reacting to his behaviors. And your school shifts from behavior management or from being late or from dealing with red bubbles to proactive early intervention represented by the blue bubble. In fact, 99.9% of your interventions when you implement the CPS model are going to be proactive, not reactive. Remember this, by the time the kid exhibits the behavior, you're late. And one of your mantras is, don't be late. Okay, we are really confident that if your staff shift to expectation management by using collaborative and proactive solutions model, there will be way fewer times when they need to step in to manage behavior issues. And let me tell you, we've got some solid data to back that up. Take, for instance, this school system in Maine. They had 3 classrooms where they were constantly dealing with behavior problems, using things like restraint and seclusions. But when they switched gears and started implementing CPS, which led them to be more in expectation management and more proactive, those incidents dropped dramatically. I mean, they're practically down to 0 now. It just goes to show how important it is to help adults in your building to be proactive, blue bubble, and not reactive, red bubble. Okay, one more sampling. Here's something truly eye-opening. These data come straight from the largest school system in Virginia. Before they implemented the CPS model, they were grappling with thousands of restraint and seclusions each year. But now they have practically slashed those numbers down to 0. It's an outstanding transformation that highlights the fabulous impact of the collaborative and proactive solutions model. One thing's for certain, the more we teach staff how to manage crisis, the more they manage crisis. It's amazing what happens when schools shift from crisis management to true crisis prevention. Better for the kids, better for the staff. It's better for everyone. Here we are, the ultimate tool for proactive interventions, focusing on managing expectations rather than reacting to behaviors. With the use of this tool, 2 entirely different universes emerge. Crisis management or behavior management, people who are not using CPS are trapped in, versus expectation management or crisis prevention when people are using the CPS model. This tool has enabled numerous organizations to achieve what many believe to be too difficult. You can find this tool on the Lives in the Balance website, by the way. It's free, it's easy to understand. You can even watch a video that will explain how to use it. Once again, it's free. All the tools from Dr. Russ Green's model are free and easily accessible on his website, livesinthebalance.org. So this tool will help you gather the missing information about your Jake. That is why Jake sometimes struggles. So the first question, the first missing piece of information we are looking for when we're thinking about our Jake is why. Why sometimes Jakes struggle to tolerate frustrations or to deal with problems. And the second piece of missing information we're looking for is when Jake has difficulty meeting some expectations. So let's take a few short minutes to refresh our understanding of why certain people, in this case, Jake, have difficulty tolerating frustrations or facing problems. You have heard several specialists talk about this, and I also went quickly over it earlier when I was introducing Jake to you. Why do sometimes some people, in this case Jake, are exhibiting some concerning behaviors? Well, it's because Jake has sometimes difficulty accessing some skills as identified in the top section of your ASIP. The research on kids with concerning behaviors, thousands of research, mountains of research, are all coming up to the conclusion that these kids, these little Jakes, are struggling with skills, not with will or motivation. Behaviors is about skills, not will. Indeed, the top section of your ASIP on this slide will help you answer the question why. And also, it will ensure that the people working with Jake understand which skills Jake sometimes has difficulty accessing when he faced with certain problems. Completing the first section of the ASIP will take you roughly 2-3 minutes. So take a look at this slide where Jake's ASIP is in the spotlight. And you won't believe it, but Jake is batting a solid 15 skills out of 16 that he sometimes struggles with. The 16 skills that you've got on top of your ASIP are the skills that are needed to behave well. And we fill that out for Jake. And now we know that 15 out of 16 are sometimes hard for Jake to access. No surprises here. Jake has been keeping us on our toes since forever, just like countless other kiddos you're probably dealing with. At least now that we've completed the first section, all the adults working with Jake are in an agreement. No wonder why he struggles so much. If Jake could do well, he would do well. He's just having some trouble with a few skills. This brings us to the second section of the ASIP, which will help us answer the second most important question for being early or proactive with your interventions, the when question, like at what moment or facing what expectation does Jake has difficulty tolerating frustration or managing problems? Well, the answer could be applied to all of us. At what moment do we sometimes exhibit less than ideal behaviors? When we struggle to meet an expectation that life is having for us. And this could be a social expectation, a behavioral expectation, an emotional expectation, or even an academic expectation in a school. It's the same for Jake. And by identifying all the expectations that Jake sometimes struggles to meet, we can then ensure that we are managing unmet expectations or dealing with blue bubbles, as we said earlier. To give you a glimpse, I have thrown in a sampler on this slide of Jake's blue bubbles or Jake's unsolved problems. It's more precisely in the bottom section of the ASIP. It's quite small, so I will read them to you. And yes, you heard me right. It's only a sampler, just 6 blue bubbles or 6 expectations he sometimes struggled with. Because let's face it, Jake's list of unsolved problems isn't something new. He's been struggling for years, and his collection of blue bubbles or his collection of unsolved problems has only ballooned. That's what happens when interventions focus on symptoms or focus on behaviors and are trying to modify those symptoms for too long, rather than tackling the problems that are causing those behaviors. So here's what you'll find in Jake's sampler. Difficulty putting his cell phone in his backpack during class time. Difficulty getting to morning class before the bell. Difficulty keeping his hands to himself in the hallway during break. Difficulty getting started on his assignment in ELA class. Difficulty remaining silent during classwork. Difficulty waiting to be called on to share an answer in ELA. Isn't it wonderful to see this long list of unsolved problems? Finally, we can shift into expectation management mode and move away from behavior management with Jake. Finally, the adults working with Jake won't be in a perpetual survival mode when around him. So, once you have filled out your ASIP about your Jake, you will be ready to be in expectation management. How so? Well, now that you know about almost, if it's not all of the expectation that Jake may sometimes struggle with, now that you know almost all, if it's not all of the blue bubbles that can set in motion some difficulty or some symptoms or some stress responses or some concerning behaviors for Jake, you don't need to wait until the next time Jake struggles with that to try to do something about it. You can plan. You can be proactive. Which brings me to the next slide. How are you going to keep track? So the second sheet in this model is the problem-solving plan, also available as an editable version on the Lives in the Balance website, where all the resources, again, are free. The problem-solving plan has 3 columns, each for a different unsolved problem. So the top box identifies the unsolved problem, helping us track the issues we're addressing and those that we're not addressing right now. So as for Jake, we've decided to prioritize difficulty putting his cell phone in his backpack during class time because, you know what, it's really frequent. We must solve that. It's a priority. We also prioritize his difficulty getting to morning class before the bell, also very frequent. We need to solve that. And finally, we decided to prioritize his difficulty keeping his hands to himself in the hallway during break, because it's almost a safety issue, that one. You know, it's really about safety. So safety is a big thing in CPS. If you have some safety issues, you're going to prioritize those. The next box is crucial. The next box under the one where you're writing the unsolved problem is who is responsible for solving the problem with the kid. This should be the person whose expectation the kid is struggling to meet, usually the classroom teacher or a specialist, not the administrators or the mental health staff. This model has a great track record for reducing or eliminating discipline referrals and punitive measures that are happening after the discipline referrals. Instead, teachers might send a problem-solving referral to the office for time and coverage to address issues directly with the kid. So teachers, instead of sending a behavioral referral to the office, they will send out a Plan B referral that I'm going to talk about more in a few seconds, saying, Anyone can help me out with some coverage? I need to problem solve something with a kid in my class. We'll need to discuss time management because teachers and specialists will need time to solve problems with kids. And you know what? They're already spending quite a lot of time dealing with behaviors. So in the balance, the amount of time is the same. It's just that instead of using the time to deal with behaviors, they're going to use the same amount of time, but to problem solve, which by the end will help them, because if you solve the problems that are causing the behaviors are we're going to get rid of the behaviors. So it's the same kind of time, the same amount of time that we're going to spend. Okay, the remaining boxes on the problem-solving plan guide us through the 3 steps of the collaborative problem solving, which we will cover shortly. So once a problem is solved, it's replaced by another one that we pick from our ASIP, right? From our assessment of skills and unsolved problems. This tool keeps us organized, systematic, and prevents issue from slipping through the cracks. So far in your building, when you're filling out an ASIP, you should have a problem-solving plan coming with it, okay? Now, how are we going to solve the problems we've identified? You have 3 options: Plan A, Plan B, Plan C. Dr. Green simplified the many ways caregivers address problems with kids into these 3 basic options, which is a nice shorthand for approaching problems. In this model, you're really only using 2 of these 3 plans, the Plan B and the Plan C. Plan A is only included on this slide because it's still very popular, but you almost never use it when you're implementing this model. We only need, hold on, I think that's someone, okay, just want to close the mic. Okay, we only need these plans for expectation the kid isn't reliably meeting. What I mean is, if the kid meets your expectations, you don't need a plan. For example, if the kid is coming to school on time, or if the kid is keeping his cell phone in his backpack during class, you don't need a plan because these expectations are met. It's not an unsolved problem. But if the kid is having difficulty meeting an expectation, you need a plan. And in reality, you have 3 options. But in this model, again, you're going to use only 2 of those options, the Plan B and the Plan C. Let's start with the Plan A. Still very popular. It's very popular all over the globe still. What is the Plan A? So to illustrate each of the plans, we're going to use one of the blue bubble or one of the unsolved problem that Jake is having. Difficulty putting his cell phone in his backpack during class time. So each plans that I'm going to describe, I'm going to use keywords to help you remember them, okay? Plan A keywords, ready? Plan A is an attempt to solve the problem with first keyword, a unilateral solution and an uninformed solution. So unilateral and uninformed are the 2 keywords to remember to identify, am I using a Plan A right now? So if you are trying to solve a problem with a unilateral, meaning that the adult decides on the solution, and an uninformed solution, meaning that we don't fully understand what's getting in Jake's way to meet the expectation. We have some hypotheses, some adult theories, but we're not fully informed about what's getting in your way, Jake. How do you know you're using a Plan A? Well, if you hear yourself saying, I decided that, or something around those lines, you're probably about to use a Plan A. So here's an example. Okay, Jake. Since we've noticed that you sometimes struggle keeping your cell phone in your backpack during class time, we've decided that, keywords, that while we're going to put a little sticky note on your desk, reminding you that it needs to stay in your backpack. So in the example that I just gave you, my expectation is putting his cell phone in his backpack during class time, right? My expectation is the same. The piece that is the plan A is putting a reminder on his desk. That's my unilateral and uninformed solution. Plan A sometimes comes with consequences, not always, but sometimes. Usually consequences gets into the game when the unilateral and uninformed solution we've been trying isn't helping much. So it could sound like this. Okay, Jake. So even though you've got this beautiful sticky note, this very cute reminder on your desk, you still struggle keeping your cell phone in your backpack. So we've decided, again, an indicator that I'm about to do a plan A. So we've decided that next time we see your cell phone out of your backpack, we're going to remove it from you for 24 hours. So in the example I gave you, same expectation. Keeping your cell phone in your backpack, the piece that is the plan A, the unilateral uninformed solution, is we're going to remove the cell phone from you for 24 hours. Okay. There is a huge difference between plan A versus an expectation. So I hope you notice that the plan A is the attempt to solve the problem unilaterally and with an uninformed solution. In collaborative and proactive solutions, we don't recommend the use of plan A for many reasons, but I'm only going to cover a few of those reasons in a matter of time, of course. We don't recommend plan A because plan A with kids who struggle accessing skills most of the time will cause more concerning behaviors. I'm going to repeat this in slow motion. Plan A with the kids who is quite challenging will cause more challenging behaviors. It's not a good thing. If you try to help, don't make things worse. If your treatment is causing more symptoms, it's not a good idea. So that's one of the downside of plan A, a major one. And strangely, do you know who are the kids on whom we are applying the most plan A on? The kids who are the least equipped to deal with plan A. Isn't it strange? Here's another downside of using plan A. Plan A is about power and control quite often, and power causes conflict. Plan A is not about partnership. Plan A doesn't build skills, doesn't enhance the skills. And we know that the reason why Jake exhibits so many symptoms is because he is sometimes having difficulty accessing skills. So we need to enhance that. Plan A doesn't do that. Plan A doesn't involve the kid into solving the problems that affect his life. So that's why we do not recommend plan A. The only reason why I would use a plan A is if it's an unmet expectation, an expectation that I was not aware that the kid would struggle with. It's a surprise. You know, we've never been to the zoo, and I was not aware that Jake would struggle being in line to see the animals. And then there is a safety issue with that. I would use a plan A on that. But once we've used a plan A, it's not a surprise anymore. We can be proactive. Let's move on to plan C. So plan C. Plan C is the plan that you're going to use on all the unsolved problems that you haven't prioritized. So for Jake, we haven't prioritized his difficulty completing his ELA assignment on time. Our plate is full. This is not something we are prioritizing right now. Remember, on my problem-solving plan, it was not on my top 3 bubbles, right? So it automatically, by default, goes into my plan C. And again, plan C is proactive. How can you be proactive? Super easy. I filled out my ASIP. I know this is not something we are treating with the plan B. This is not a prioritized unsolved problem. So proactively, consciously, and diligently, we as adults working with Jake can decide, okay, we need to remove his difficulty giving his ELA assignment on time. So we're going to put that expectation on hold. We're going to put that on the back burner for now, right? So right now, we don't have that expectation for Jake. Not forever, not for all the kids. For him, for now, until we have solved an unsolved problems that we prioritized, so we can pick a new one in our ALSUP. So if I'm not prioritizing his difficulty giving back his ELA assignment on time, here's how it could look like. So let's imagine we are in the ELA class, and let's imagine that it's the time where normally the ELA teacher would say to Jake, hey, buddy, do you have your homework? Well, if the teacher is plan C'ing this, here's how it's going to look like. It's going to look like this. And no, it's not my Zoom who just froze. It's me who don't have the expectation that Jake give me his ELA assignment on time. I don't have that expectation for now, for him, because we're working on other things right now. So plan C is your triage plan. Plan C will help you manage the expectation that you're not prioritizing right now. Plan C will help you stabilize the symptoms. Also, well, Jake is having concerning behaviors when the expectation outstrip the skills, when the expectation that life is having for him is outstripping the skills that he can access at that moment. That's when you see an incompatibility episode. So if you plan C expectation, you are removing the expectation that outstrip the skills. So the concerning behaviors will diminish. They will be reduced. So plan C is a big part of the CPS model because that's a great plan to manage your expectations that you haven't prioritized. Finally, you've got the plan B. So how are we going to stabilize a kid like Jake, a kid with a lot of concerning behaviors? We're going to do it with two big components. We're going to try to remove as much as possible the plan A because often plan A with Jake are causing more concerning behaviors. So that's going to reduce the fever a little bit. Then we'll introduce our plan C because again, by removing expectations that we already know that Jake reliably has difficulty meeting, that will also reduce the fever. And then you've got more traction with your active treatment, the plan B. So the plan B is a conversation that the adult do proactively with the kids. When you're starting to use plan B with kids, you are achieving many things, but the two main things that you can achieve with that is by doing the plan B, by going through the 3 steps of this plan B conversation, you are enhancing the skills. You are developing the skills that Jake is having difficulty sometimes accessing. If you develop the skills And Jake is in a situation where life is expecting him to be good with these skills. He will use these skills, and then you'll see less symptoms. The second thing that you're going to be able to achieve with your plan B is that you're going to be able to engage Jake into solving the problems that are affecting his life. And by doing that, by solving those problems, again, the concerning behaviors will reduce, because only unsolved problems are causing concerning behaviors. So the plan B has 3 steps. And if you go on the website, on the livesinthebalance.org website, you're going to be able to access to a huge library of Plan B's video done by Dr. Green with different kids, with a full class, or done from educators with different kind of kids, even 3 and 4 years old kids' videos. So today, obviously, we won't have time to go thoroughly through the 3 steps. But at this point, what I want you to remember is don't be late. So use your ASIP. Ask the kid. Use your plan B. Talk with the kid. Find out what's getting in your way and collaborate to find a solution that will address what's getting in his way to meet the expectation. With the plan B, what you're literally doing, you are defining what's the problem about. And I thought that I should share this quote from Albert Einstein. He once said that if he had to solve a problem, only 1 hour to solve a problem, he would spend 55 minutes defining what's the problem about and only 5 minutes finding the solution. In many places, that's not what's going on. In many places, even if we don't understand what's the problem about, we are imposing solutions. How can that be, how can that be effective? If we don't know what's the problem about, we cannot solve the problem. Now, let me just close by saying that we do this work with many, many schools all over the world, including many in Massachusetts. And we know the kids. We know how difficult they can be. We know the staff. We know the pressures schools are under. We know how hard the work is, and we know that the work doesn't need to be as hard as it is. We know that every school and classroom are unique, and just as we do with kids, we are going to meet you where you're at. We are in the trenches with you. We are quite confident that we can help you eliminate the use of timeout rooms without compromising safety and without increasing the use of restraint or police referrals. So we would welcome the opportunity to work with you and to provide your staff with a very positive learning experience. And I'm eager to talk with you about your specific needs and how we can help you in a specific way. So when we work with organizations, we help them go through those 4 phases that you see on this slide. Phase number 1, we're creating a core group in your building, 8 to 10 people that you're thinking they're going to be my rock stars in the building. They're going to learn how to use the tools of the model. They're going to become proficient. And as soon as they are proficient, we're moving on into phase 2, where they start to mentor other people in your building. So your rock star in the building are teaming up with another staff member who was not in the core group. And that's how we grow capacity in your building. They start mentoring and eventually they start coaching. The phase number X, so you can think that phase 1, 2, 3 are sequential, but phase X, which is the 4th phase, is kind of overlapping the 3 first phases. Phase X is something that we work on with you. That's where I say we meet you where you're at. Because if we are implementing this approach in your building, we need to work a little bit on your system. There might be a few things that we need to tweak a little bit. So that's how we're doing it. So let's see if we do have a few questions or thoughts or comments from the audience. So Stephanie, is
Yeah,
there any question? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't see any questions right now, and we're getting very close to the end of the time, but I just wanted to thank you so much. And is there a slide that shows how to contact Lives in Balance?
Absolutely. Thank you for reminding me. That's the slide. So livesinthebalance.org or the truecrisisprevention.org website.
Your presentation has been incredibly informative, and I know that Lives in the Balance has done wonderful work in school districts. So thank you so much for your presentation, and we will move on to our next presenter. Thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you all.
All right, we will move on to Corey. And Cynthia, if you could stop the slide share, then Corey can load his slides. That would be super helpful. Thank you. And Corey, I will welcome you now. And thank you so much for joining us. And feel free to share your slides at any point while I'm doing your introduction. We are thrilled to have Corey join us today. He's currently the Building Communities of Care Director of Operations. Corey is responsible for the oversight and implementation of the BCC curriculum across all JRI sites, which currently consist of over 85 trainers, as well as external training and consultation. Corey has been with JRI for over 11 years, working in various administrative and leadership roles across multiple residential schools, as well as the director of the JRI COVID Isolation Unit. As an administrator in the residential settings, Corey focused on the training and development of staff to provide a safe and trauma-informed environment of care. Corey represents BCC at national conferences, and he has led multiple training initiatives and implementation teams to establish high standards of trauma-informed treatment within programs, both internally and through his role as a consultant. Welcome, Corey.
Thank you very much for the kind words, Stephanie. I very much appreciate that. Thank you, everyone, for having me here today. I'm looking forward to talk about Building Communities of Care, which is a trauma-informed crisis prevention training curriculum that we utilize at Justice Resource Institute. Just a little bit about my background and history. I know we shared a little bit. I worked for JRI for 13 years, and I've been in this specific training capacity for the past 7. So the mission at JRI. So JRI is a nonprofit located in Massachusetts. We also support Rhode Island and Connecticut as well. Justice Resource Institute works in partnership with individuals, families, communities, and government to pursue the social justice inherent in opening up doors to opportunity and independence. The BCC mission, I also added that here, BCC short for Building Communities of Care, to teach participants to provide trauma-informed, individualized, and strength-based interventions in a nurturing and supportive community of care. So before we jump in and continue to talk about Building Communities of Care, one of the things we really want to focus on is trauma and the impact that trauma can have on individuals in their course of escalation, the behaviors, the responses, some of the presentations that we may see. So really thinking about psychological trauma, our why behind the what. Oftentimes, we don't necessarily want to address or really focus so much on what is happening. It's why is that behavior happening? What is underneath? What is driving that? Is it emotions? It is something that's going on in the individual's life? Whatever that may be, really trying to find the root of the issue that's driving some of the behaviors or presentations that we are seeing. Traumatic experiences are those that are overwhelming, invoke intense negative affect, and involve some degree of loss of control and or vulnerability. The experience of trauma is subjective and developmentally bound. So the fact that trauma can be subjective, that's really highlighting that no two traumas are the same. You and I could be involved in a similar situation, such as a car accident, and come out with 2 very different experiences. So trauma is very specific to the individual. And just because I don't deem something as traumatic doesn't mean that it's not traumatic to someone else. And that's what we have to recognize, how to support what someone else is identifying as a traumatic experience or situation. In the experience of trauma being developmentally bound, we really want to think about the different developmental stages that individuals experience and go throughout life. Thinking about infants really receiving a lot of nurturing and support, and then maybe we're lying on our back and then starting to roll over to our stomach, and then we're starting to crawl and stand up and walk and talk, and all those different developmental milestones, they typically kind of have age appropriate norms associated with them. Sometimes when individuals have experienced traumatic situations, they haven't had the opportunity to learn and develop and grow those skills, but life continues to move forward. So they develop maybe different ways to manage emotions or their regulation, or how to handle certain situations or experiences that we might not deem safe, appropriate, kind of in line with what we're looking to see in some of our classrooms or different settings. Next, I want to talk about the stress response. So really the regulation of responses that happens when an individual is presented with different fear or threats. So we talk about the sympathetic nervous system. This is what manages normal reactions to fear or threats. This is really what kind of promotes our survival. It's that adrenaline rush that you get, that fight, flight, freeze response that we all have inside of us, or fawn as well. And when those things happen, we have the ability to at times recognize, okay, the threat is gone, or we are safe in this moment, and we can shut that off. Sometimes individuals don't have the ability to turn that off. So constantly their body is on alert, or their mind is on alert for fear and threat. And they don't have the ability to turn that down. So if we look at our parasympathetic nervous system, this is really what's responsible for stopping those responses so that we have the ability to rest and regenerate and allow our body to relax and be able to be in control and be regulated and be present and engaged in whatever we may be doing. This is when we can recognize that we're safe. And again, at times, individuals sometimes don't have the ability to do this. What I'd like people to do for me real quick is, if we can be a little bit creative, engaging on a Friday afternoon, feel free to share in the chat box for me. But if people can just close their eyes, just imagine on a nice, beautiful Friday afternoon like today, you're driving down the highway, got the nice wind blowing in your hair, windows are down, maybe you're going by the ocean, you got the waves crashing, really beautiful afternoon, and then you see blue lights in your mirror. What happens to your body in that moment? Share that in the chat box for me if people are so comfortable. What happens to your body in that moment? Oops. Muscles tighten, stress response. Yeah, you probably start checking, am I speeding? Checking your seatbelt, become rigid, become very nervous. The heart starts to pump and kind of pound through. You might start sweating. All of those things happen to your body when you saw that. Now, let me ask you all a question. Did you choose for that to happen to your body? You didn't. That's an experience that, based on past history or past experiences that you've been involved in, what that could mean causes your body to have all of those thoughts and those reactions and bodily responses in the moment. Now, what we really want to think about is that's a universal example that a lot of us can relate to. I also want to make sure I make this very clear that in my experience, and I'm talking my experience only, I have the ability to shut that off when I get pulled over. All those things might happen, and I have the ability to take a few deep breaths, use some of my coping mechanisms, and say, okay, I might get a ticket, but I'm going to be okay in this moment. For some individuals that maybe haven't had positive experiences with police or had negative interactions in the past, they might not be able to shut that off in that moment due to their own experience. And what I want people to take away from that is that a lot of times the individuals, the youth that we're supporting, those very same things are going on in them. They're not necessarily choosing to have some of these bodily responses or these reactions. They don't know how to manage what's going on inside of them. They're not sure how to communicate effectively to get their needs met. So you see it coming out in different ways. But a lot of times they're not in control, just like we didn't choose for all of these other things to happen. And that could be for a variety of reasons. That could be because there's some peer bullying or things happening going on. That could be because there's a lot of stress and a lot of things going on at the home. That could be because I have the fear to have to read out loud in front of a class and I'm embarrassed and shy to do so. There could be a lot of reasons that we see some of these different responses and reactions in individuals. I do want to just share a quick video. I think this is a great explanation to kind of talk about how we just described that the brain can be impacted by different situations and experiences that we have. And I think it's really important that we think about ways that we can help connect and help the kids that we're working with kind of understand that a little bit as well. So I'm going to share this video real quick. Come on. My apologies for the delay. Just one second. Okay, I'm going to give it about 5 more seconds, and if it doesn't load, I will come back to that. So I apologize. Oh, perfect. Here we are.
So I want to talk for a minute about how to teach the brain. One of the really important things that we know in trauma is that when we help people understand the injury trauma creates in the brain and help them understand how that impacts the way they respond to other events in the world, it really helps them and their families move forward in their healing. So lots of people have given ways to teach the brain. As a practitioner myself, I've taken a lot of the models from Dr.
My apologies about that, everyone. Okay, hopefully everyone should be able to see this now.
So I want to talk for a minute about how to teach the brain. One of the really important things that we know in trauma is that when we help people understand the injury trauma creates in the brain and help them understand how that impacts the way they respond to other events in the world, it really helps them and their families move forward in their healing. So lots of people have given ways to teach the brain. As a practitioner myself, I've taken a lot of the models from Dr. Dan Siegel, taken models from the Hahn Foundation for teaching in the optimistic classroom, and looking at some of the things Ledoux has done, and put them together and really challenged myself and folks that I educate about practicing really teaching the brain. So when I explain this to teenagers, I start with the hand model, okay? And I start by explaining that we're going to talk about the downstairs brain and the upstairs brain that everyone has. Formally, this is called the limbic system, and this is called the cerebral cortex. But what we're going to talk is downstairs brain and upstairs brain. So in your downstairs brain, this is where fight, flight, or freeze lives, okay? When threat comes at you, your body has 3 reactions it can make. It can fight, it can run away, or it can stay very still until the danger's gone. That's what this brain does, okay? This part of the brain. What's up here, the upstairs brain, its job, among many other things, is to solve problems, to help you calm down, solve problems, okay? And to tell the downstairs brain, I got this. We're going to be okay. There's another solution. So what happens a lot of times to kids who've experienced trauma is if you think about these like muscles, because you've gone through a lot of threat, this downstairs part of the brain's been doing push-ups your whole life, okay? So this part of the brain's really strong. The part of your brain that solves problems hasn't had as much exercise because you've had to be really strong to be a survivor, a thriver. So what happens is that the brain gets what I call emotionally hijacked. This downstairs brain comes up on top of this brain, it takes over, okay? So the downstairs brain's in control. And so you fight, you run, you freeze. The only things that work when you're down here are things that calm you down. So they call them self-regulation skills. And that happens from connection. Somebody talking to you, helping you breathe, helping you feel your body calm down. Once that happens, then the upstairs brain can come back, and then you can solve problems. So that's how I try to explain to teenagers the downstairs brain and the upstairs brain, and what happens to them when they experience a threat. With young children, what I've found is they like animals. When I say young, probably 3 to 8 years old. Sometimes teenagers like it too. And so what we call this is the downstairs brain, that threat center again, is what I call the barking dog. If you think about when any noise or threat makes, usually a dog will bark. So this is the barking dog, okay? A problem solver is often called the wise owl. So upstairs is the wise owl, downstairs is the barking dog, okay? When the dog barks, the owl flies away. And so when the dog's barking, the only things they can do are maybe practice blowing bubbles, maybe practice breathing deeply, things that help the dog start calming down. And that's where you build their self-care strategies. They practice lots of different things to help the dog stop barking. The first skill being recognizing when their dog barks. Once they learn how to calm the barking dog, then the owl flies back, and then they can come up with solutions. And again, they're trying to get this muscle stronger. The problem for most people who are intervening, if you're talking to a family, most parents are going to naturally start with redirection and consequences for negative behavior. That's the first place they go. They're shaking fingers and telling somebody, stop that, you need to do this. That's an upstairs brain intervention, while most children who've experienced trauma are downstairs. So the term Siegel uses is you connect, then you redirect. The only thing that will calm a barking dog or the downstairs brain is helping that child calm down. And only then, once you teach the child to calm down, can you engage the part of the brain that solves problems and actually come up with solutions for better behavior choices. And that's why it's important to respond to the need, respond to the safety needs that get kicked up by threat, and not just react to the behavior.
Okay. So hopefully we can see my screen again, but I think that that's just important because I think it's a need for individuals to help understand kind of what's going on inside of them so that we can help them recognize what are some of the triggers or things that maybe drive some of these responses in us, but also labeling different ways to be able to help intervene. And once we can recognize that, then we can start to identify what helps us and calms us down. So I think really having that approach and understanding that at times it may be a focus on regulation as opposed to limit setting because the individual doesn't have the capacity to understand maybe the limit in the moment, as we just saw in that video. So now I want to shift a little bit over to some different types of responses that we may see. So these are just some examples of the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn responses, trauma responses that individuals may have. Think about, do any of these maybe stick out to you that kind of highlight and recognize something that maybe you do when you're faced with a little bit of stress or things that maybe are going on for you? Always just think it's important for us to also recognize how we are impacted by the work as much as the individuals are impacted that we're supporting as well. And then here's just how the stress response may show up in some of the kids that we work with. So, the fight response might be that yelling and screaming, the hitting, kicking, biting, the blaming, deflecting, the flight response, wanting to always escape or run away, unfocused, hard to be able to pay attention or focus on the task at hand, fidgeting or restlessness, or the freeze response, maybe shutting down, mind going blank, urge to hide, kind of isolation. So really looking at when we're seeing these different responses in individuals, now, how do we intervene and what's the appropriate tool to support that need that we're seeing? So we want to think about the biological impact on the central nervous system, normative stress response versus trauma reactivity. Thinking about neurobiological, really thinking about that frontal lobe. We're talking about that's the first thing that ceases to function when we become escalated or start to lose control. And that's the part of the brain that allows us to use your decision making, follow step-by-step direction, use rationale, think kind of cause and effect. That's that first part of the brain that goes away. And then really, I also just want people to take away and remember that trauma-informed approaches will be effective for all students, It's not necessarily just effective for students that have identified trauma specific for that individual. This is going to support all students. Everyone's been through something traumatic, different experiences and situations. Also, even think about like the large impact that COVID has had on individuals and capacity to learn and being in classrooms and engaging. A lot of different ways that individuals can be impacted by this. One of the last things I want to share and talk about is we want to think about stage, not age. So we talked about at times that individuals may be impacted by trauma that can developmentally impact their skill set or their ability to do or navigate certain situations or experiences or interactions. So we want to think stage, not age. The extent to which we develop particular skills varies depending on many factors, including our need for a particular skill, our available resources, and the feedback and input we receive from our environment. I think oftentimes we may see individuals needing support to grow and develop skills in certain areas, but there are certain skills that some individuals, based on their situations or environments that they're in, that they may develop and acquire skills a lot quicker than anticipated. So how do we tap in and utilize those as strengths or recognize those as strengths to positively support the individual? So really thinking about meeting them where they're at. I do want to acknowledge just a few things, thinking in regards to the building of communities of care curriculum. We always want to keep in mind the impact of trauma when thinking about different techniques and activities, how that may impact students that we're supporting. That behavior is always a form of communication, often a way of trying to communicate specific needs. Oftentimes we see a need for connection, a need for containment. And when I say containment, I'm talking about like additional support, added help in certain areas because they may not have the ability or skill set to master a task on their own, or control of a situation. I think a lot of times individuals feel out of control. So where can we provide control back? That's not to say that we're taking away limits, rules, and expectations, but can we be flexible within those to meet a specific individual's needs? Attunement is a key factor in building successful relationships. Really that proactivity, being able to read and recognize and respond to verbal and nonverbal cues that individuals may have or present. And this may be something subtle as an individual who's usually pretty engaged, that maybe they're putting their head down, or maybe for individuals in my experience that maybe typically dress a certain way 9 days out of 10, and one other day they dress a little bit differently. Sometimes that's an indicator that they're not feeling so good about themselves today, or things seem to be a little bit off. So how can we proactively recognize some of these cues and individualize our response on how to be able to help them, or recognize, well, you know what, we have Corey today, and Corey looks like he might only be about 75 or 80%, but you know what, he's here. So how can I give them that extra 15 or 20% to make today be successful? All of the strategies that we're going to talk about, today in general, but also in the Building Communities of Care curriculum, this is a large menu of different strategies, tools, concepts, ideas, and themes to use to really support a variety of different individuals with varying levels of need. The goal is for us to build a tool belt where we have the ability to offer A, B, C, D, E, and have these different varieties of skills. So hopefully with that tool belt, we're able to meet the needs of all the different individuals that we work with. And as we recognize those needs, we want to individualize their usage. What's effective for me may not be what's effective for you. So how do we pick from the tool belt on how to intervene in this moment? And we want to be culturally inclusive and responsive within our environments and programming, really taking into those cultural aspects into account for the individuals that we're working with. Do we give opportunities for them to express themselves and support themselves in those ways? And are we able to connect or support the work that we're doing while being mindful of those things? So now we're going to talk about what Building Communities of Care, or BCC, is. So it's really a culture change. It's not just like a one-off training, let's take one or two things. It's really thinking about taking a trauma-informed approach and incorporating that into not just the way that we interact with students, but the systems that we have, the routines that we have, the way that we set up our classroom environments. They're all trauma-informed, And we incorporate that in through documentation, through the way that we give assessment or provide projects or things like that for individuals, really trying to shift the culture in a way that we're supporting youth. So we want to train caregivers to think about individuals differently through the lenses of ARC and BCC. So ARC is attachment regulation competency. That's a trauma-informed framework that we utilize at JRI, and BCC is an application of ARC. This is how we're doing ARC on the day-to-day, is through this BCC intervention in this curriculum. We really focus on 3 chapters in building communities of care. The environment, really thinking about how can we have an individual feel safe and comfortable in an environment. When they can do that, it's going to allow them to step outside their comfort zone and work on and grow and develop new skills in different areas. We're going to talk a little bit about treatment, having everyone understand how their role is impacting treatment. And when I say treatment, I really mean the opportunity to build skills. How are we helping individuals build skills in the classroom, but they're also going to translate outside of the classroom? And then engagement. How do we build skills and tolerance and help individuals build successful, positive, and appropriate relationships that hopefully can foster positive engagement moving forward for them? So one of the tools that we use in building communities of care is we dissect each one of those 3 chapters that I just talked about. We look at that through a bullseye model lens. So we really look at individual factors. Those are anything specific to the individual. So that might be that Corey comes in and he struggles to maybe read at a 2nd grade level, but he's in a 5th grade classroom. That might mean that Corey comes in and he struggles to work with female authority figures. That might mean that Corey comes in and he struggles to build relationships with his peers. Really any type of individual factor. So anything specific to an individual that's coming to us, those are going to be individual factors. Naturally, they're the center part of the bullseye because we want to build everything around supporting that individual. Then if we look at that next rung, those are the community factors. When we think of community factors, I don't want to get confused and think of like that larger, greater community. We want to think about your school, your site, your program that you're supporting the youth at. Those are the community factors. So the way that your classes are structured, the schedule that you have, opportunities for break and flexibility through the day, built-in times of regulation, the routines that you have, the way that we interact with the youth and the students. Really, for a lack of better words, the things that we kind of have control over within our school or our setting. And then we also want to look at external factors. These are other things that are going to impact the individual and our ability to provide and do our job in some way, shape, or form. Maybe that's something that is going on and happening in the community. So, maybe school is closed for a day or 2. That's an external factor that impacts our ability to be able to provide support at a community level to the individual that we're working with. Maybe we have certain expectations around, licensing and regulations as far as things that we need to do and provide. All those external factors are going to be things that are outside of maybe your school, but are going to impact your ability to operate, to function, guidelines, different expectations that you have to meet to be able to support an individual. So really looking at 3 different layers of how an individual can be supported through themselves, us at the school level, and then other aspects of that, such as family, community, other different levels of involvement outside of the school. And then this is another tool that we'll utilize, and this is really how we want to look at each individual. I think, you work with so many different people that look at individuals so differently. So how do we have a consistent, unified, uniform language that everyone can utilize to refer to an individual on? So we all have the same kind of understanding of what we're talking about. So we call this the continuum of support. So we really look at this as an assessment of maybe where an individual may be or how they're presenting in the moment. So if we look at that longer middle line, it's going up and down, that's going to be an individual's baseline. So that's maybe how they're typically presenting more often than not, or on the average day, if they're presenting as engaged, motivated, working after maybe a little bit disengaged, a little bit quieter. If maybe they're normally a talker in the classroom, or normally they like to participate and volunteer, whatever their kind of norm is, how they often present, that's what we want to look at is their baseline. And then if we look to the left side of the continuum of support, we're looking at external supports and containment. So that's really where maybe an individual is struggling in a certain area. So we have to provide some supports and containment around that. So maybe that's an individual struggling to stay at their desk in class. There's a whole lot of things that we could do. We could maybe do a classroom activity that involves some movement to get movement for that individual. Maybe we have a tool that's at their desk that allows them to move their feet or be able to move back and forth, but still stay in their seat and be present with the rest of the group and the rest of the class. Maybe none of those are working and they need to take a physical break outside of the classroom in a different area with a different staff, whatever that may look like. All of those would be a different form of containment or an external support because the individual can't maintain being in the classroom safely or appropriately. We're going to have to provide a different level of support and containment around that to help them manage whatever that need is. So part of it is for us to identify the need and then think, how do we take one of these interventions or responses and now address what we're seeing as this need? And then if we look at the other side of the continuum of support, that's where some individuals have internalized the skill or they're having successful independence in those areas. And there may be some students that for the ability to stay in class, they're pretty far over to the right. They don't really need to take breaks. They're not really ever asked to get up. They're usually able to stay and kind of manage things and navigate that in the classroom. You're going to know your individuals better in those ways. But on those days where maybe most days Corey can engage and present in the classroom, but today he's just really presenting a little bit differently, that's when we want to look and assess that Corey's presenting differently. I can do the same thing I did yesterday, but that's probably not going to be effective and helpful based on what he's showing me. So how do I do something a little extra or a little more to make it be successful for today? So we're talking about the environment. We want to think about, is the environment safe? And again, think about what that means to you. If some people want to share in the chat box as we go through some of these questions, feel free. I think that's definitely helpful and can engage in the process as we talk. But what are some things that make the environment safe? What are some things that might make the environment predictable? Are there schedules? Are there routines? So bully free. I think that's an important thing about the environment. So, as students are moving or transitioning, when are the times that, bullying maybe happen? Is that transitioning from class to class? Can there be a better presence in the hallways or more eyes on or things like that? Relationships, absolutely. Unfortunately, not all relationships are safe, right? So how do we monitor for that? How do we teach individuals to build and maintain safe and healthy and appropriate relationships? Welcoming and building relationships. Yes, how can you make a connection with individuals within your environment with what you're doing? Connected staff, awesome. So all these things are great. I think about some cool things I've seen. I'm not sure if anyone's ever seen like the video, but it's right before a class. The teacher usually is always outside the class greeting the kids, and the whole class usually lines up one at a time. And before they go in, they all do a different handshake that they chose with that teacher before they headed in. So ways to make individual feel safe and comfortable in an environment, like they have a connection, that they're supported, that they're recognized, heard, seen, noticed. Anything that we can do about that is going to be important. Is it predictable? Thinking about routines and rhythms. When I come into the classroom, can I know what to expect? Is it going to be a warm up every day, then this thing, then the activity for the day, and then a little bit of free time or a quiz? Or does every Monday kind of look the same? Or is there ways to build in some predictability where sometimes school can be anxiety provoking enough? So how can we build it out so that individuals know what to expect and anticipate, and we can take some of that off of their plate? Is it inclusive, culturally inclusive? Is it supportive for multiple different individuals? Does it support different needs? Is there a quiet space? Is there an opportunity to get some energy out or a way to be able to do that while still staying present in the classroom? Is there flexibility for group work, but also maybe individualization? Thinking, is it comfortable? What would make it comfortable? We all have our own thoughts, but you know who's going to identify what can make things comfortable or more safe or more inclusive or more predictable? Asking the students, having them be a part of that process. Then oftentimes we can also see them take care or pride in their environment when they have a say or are involved in that, as opposed to sometimes destroying it or maybe not treating it so nicely when they have a little bit of a different perspective about it, or a part of making that environment their own. And is it supportive? Are there different tools, skills, different alternatives that are available? Corey might not engage in class today. Is there a way that I can still have him be present and get some work complete so that it's a successful experience, as opposed to, all right, leave and that's it, and we never get to get a specific need met? So really looking at alternative ways to be flexible based on what we're seeing. And obviously, I understand that this is all within the scope of what's realistic in a classroom and managing a large classroom. We talk more about that in the training as well. So the next thing I have is just a few slides of examples of different tools that can be helpful. Different fidgets that individuals can have. I used to think that, when somebody was drawing or coloring or those things, they weren't paying attention. And I actually watch a lot of people be able to do that and focus and pay attention more. So really assessing kind of how is an individual utilizing certain tools, and is it impacting them in a positive way, and being flexible in some of those areas. So these are just a few examples of tools to maybe focus on noise, or kind of build in some movement here, or keep your hands kind of busy while you're at your seat. And some can just be incorporated on everyday tools that you have, such as pencils. These are just examples of maybe what we might see in like a hallway or a certain area. So we might encourage kids that if they're taking a break, like, hey, we're going to do some bear crawls over here, or we're going to hop to do these things. Not only is it getting out like physical movement and energy, it's also causing them to put a focus or be mindful or kind of ground onto something, being able to push, place my hands, connect here. It's also connecting the body, feeling, emotions, movements. So hopefully we're able to kind of support and tie some of those things together. Sometimes individuals just like it because they want to be able to play, but sometimes we can also kind of connect what's happening and help them start to recognize when they need a shift or what they need. And it's great when they can label it for us. This is an example of just like a smart room that we might have here. It's an awesome opportunity to be able to bring kids in to get some sensory movement, utilize access to this in a room, you can see on the wall that there's different things to kind of focus on or do over there, opportunities to kind of highlight your emotion or recognize that, utilize some different skills, and then maybe recognize where is our emotional state now, how does our body feel, how did that impact us, did things feel differently? And again, we talk a lot more about these in the training as well. So that was a little bit about environment. Now we're going to shift over to treatment. So really thinking about how everything we're doing is in service of treatment and skill building. Yes, we're absolutely teaching content and material, but also how can we work on social skill development, being able to take turns or share the floor with your peer, or be positive in different situations or experience, or create a positive community where individuals feel comfortable to get up and try reading where maybe that's not the safest thing that they feel. How can you build on certain skills within your class, group, or activity? We definitely provide some activity training, really being intentional around what are your goals that you're trying to highlight with the activity, what skills are you trying to build within your different activities, and targeting some of those. Knowing each individual obviously is the best you can, but the more time that you get to spend, how do we continue to acquire that information, knowing their strengths, their goals, their needs, their preferences, and how do we incorporate that and kind of pull that into what we're doing in our day-to-day? And then the other thing I think is always so important is debriefing. Tracking growth and development. We always want to be evolving. So really having conversations about what went well, what didn't go well, what can we take away from that and replicate? I also think that a lot of times people think about debriefing like when there's a major incident or a situation happens. Yeah, naturally, we're going to talk about it, talk about ways to hopefully prevent it, or if it does happen, how do we respond? And I think that's definitely effective. But I also challenge people to debrief when you have kind of like a perfect class day or a perfect school day or something goes like that. A lot of times people say that they don't debrief and have conversations about it. And I think that's crazy. I think it's so important that if something went so well and everyone was engaged and everyone interacted and there weren't any, major behaviors or responses, why? What did we do? Was it the engagement? Was it the type of activity that we had? Was it a hands-on approach? Was it group? What was it that had everyone so engaged that we didn't see some of those things today? And how do we incorporate and replicate that a bit in what we're doing regularly? And then the last thing here is competency building experiences. So I'm not going to read the whole definition to you, but really just thinking about competency in a way as building skill in certain areas. Competency can be a variety of things, such as, art, sport, music, writing, speaking. Those absolutely can be competencies. I also think about different competencies for individuals, learning certain skills, appropriate table conversation at lunch, how to be able to take turns or share with others. Different competencies are going to be based on, obviously, the different levels and ages of individuals that you work with. So treatment, therefore, involves thinking about building, enhancing, supporting a surrounding environment and relationships and capacity to support healthy child development. So it's not just kind of, hey, we have this classroom, everyone adapt to it. It's how do we kind of have this classroom that can adapt to quite a few different types of individuals? We want to support youth in their systems in recognizing survival strengths. So we want to be able to label things and hopefully help them recognize what's going on and reorganizing those towards present goal-oriented active engagement. So sometimes survival strengths, really pulling out strengths that individuals may have. I think just certain types of words that sometimes people use that aren't necessarily person first. People might use the word like manipulative. Well, you could use that word, or you can also look at that as a strength as an individual who's resourceful or somebody that understands how to navigate different systems to get their needs met because it feels like they're probably not getting them met in a different way. So really think about framing language a little bit differently and being strength-based, and then how do we tap into those strengths and help support them in a little bit more of what we might identify as a positive or appropriate area. And then support in building and enhancing normative developmental competencies. So all the things that kids should be doing, for some of them, they don't have the opportunity to get to do some of these things because they're such constantly on alert. So how do we maybe provide that safe environment that allows them to learn different skills and have a few different opportunities that they might not have otherwise had an opportunity to engage in? So again, just a few more things to think about what we can do and really thinking about being strengths-based. I think different ways that we can deliver information to individuals is going to be very, very helpful and supportive. So for here, it says, what can I do? So this is just, again, a visual problem-solving wheel that could be posted up. Me specifically, people can talk a lot. I don't necessarily hear and take it all in, but something like this, I would read it, and that's how I would kind of register or process that information. So really thinking about the different ways that individuals learn and take in and absorb information, and how can we deliver that to them? So here's just the different skills that could be offered out. Again, you can identify what's necessary for your population. Again, this is just a way to be strengths-based. I think video games are a big thing. We wanted to get individuals to, kind of engage in this process of identifying different regulation tools and techniques. So we made it into a big video game controller that piqued kids' interest and then started a conversation around that. Whereas if we just sat around in a circle and kind of talked about regulating our feelings, they weren't really going to engage as much. So how do we kind of tap into other different strengths and interests to bring this into the conversation and pair those things up and be a little bit more strengths-based, not just tapping in and pulling their strengths, but how do we shift us into supporting their strengths as well? Then thinking about engagement. So for engagement, we have different skills that can be built upon engagement, but we really want to think about how do we build and maintain healthy and safe and appropriate relationships? And how do we teach them to do the same within our interactions? A lot of this is going to come through modeling, the boundaries that we're holding, that we're teaching, obviously, in our classrooms, the expectations that we have. But before I go into the rest of the slide, I also want to think about, how do you engage the youth in the classroom? Do they have an opportunity to choose things in the environment or choose how the environment can be impacted? Do they have an opportunity to be a part of the rules and the expectations in the classroom? Do they have an opportunity to be a part about some of the ideas of how the furniture might be set up, or some of the types of activities that we get to do? When we have that engagement and involvement, or that voice and choice, oftentimes I think we can see a little bit more of a positive interaction or positive support and engagement from the youth as well. So thinking about different activities and skills that we have here, such as leadership, independence, adversity and resilience, boundaries, social skills, teamwork, patience, frustration, tolerance, compassion, and understanding. Thinking about some of those skills, what are examples of groups, activities, lessons that we can lead that can encompass some of those? Just want to hear some of the things that you all are already doing, and being able to tie it in specifically to identifying these specific skills. What are some things that we can do to focus on some of these specific skills within the nature of our role? I'll give it just a minute for some people to type and share. And while people hopefully are going to be sharing, I also want to think about, what's the role of staff or student co-leaders? I think sometimes, somebody may be leading an activity and there may be other people there to monitor, support, or they have another classroom, but really everyone identifying what their role is. For someone's role, it might be that I'm going to do bathroom and water transitions back and forth, in and out. That's a huge vital role and a part of a process. But really, I think not just assuming that people are going to do or know what to do, but if I'm leading this, hey, I want you to be able to be a part of this. Hey, we're going to focus on this area. Having everyone really understand what their role is. And at times where maybe students don't want to participate or engage, is there a way that you can be creative to still have them participate and engage? We had I've had the opportunity to be fortunate enough to coach some sports teams in my agency. And what I found was there's quite a few kids that wanted to be a part of a sports team, but didn't really have a desire to play sports. But it was more the team aspect that they wanted to be able to build upon. So we looked at finding different roles. We had a scorekeeper for an individual, so they were a part of the team in that way. We had a team manager who would kind of support making sure the water, the uniforms, all the equipment and stuff was all set. We had a like a team editor. So they would go and kind of write who scored all the touchdowns in defense and then write up a little sports article the next week. So we were also very creative on, how do we be inclusive and supportive for individuals that maybe don't want to play the sport, but they want to be involved in this process. So how do we engage? A couple of things I have in here, providing an opportunity for individuals to take the lead. I think that's a great skill to be able to push. Share a skill that they're good at, share successes. Yeah, I love that. It kind of almost sounds like a show and tell, but it's teach and tell, right? Teach a little bit about a skill that you have that you feel confident in. That helps individuals feel great in certain areas. And again, a lot of times we just want to feel seen and heard. So how do we provide opportunities for them to do that, but also give them the control to be involved in some of these situations or experiences? Thank you very much for sharing that. I appreciate it, Anna. And then a couple of other things to think about. Different skills to use. A lot of times I think we want to think about what the individuals can use. And I think there's definitely times that they can access tools on their own. And then there's some times where we might have missed a window, or they've lost a little bit more control, and they don't have the ability to kind of navigate on their own. So we have to support them. So really thinking about co-regulation. That's us engaging the individuals in some type of regulation because they don't have the process to be able to access that on their own in that moment. And as we were talking earlier with that brain video, I think it's really important sometimes to, again, think about regulation versus limit setting. in this moment, based on what I'm seeing from this individual, are they going to be able to follow my limit? If they're not, you can continue to try to set the limit, but it's probably setting the individual up for failure, you up for frustration and some of those things. So really thinking about, okay, how can I help the individual get regulated and in control? And then we can always circle back to that limit and follow that. And I think oftentimes we want to think about regulation versus limit setting, and when do I need to help them regulate so that their brain can be online to be able to follow this next step or this next limit, or continue to engage in the classroom experience. And a few ways to do that are through mindfulness, deep breathing, a variety of different ways to do this. And again, these are things that we could talk about in training. These are also things that you can look up, and I'm sure people have a lot of experience around as well. Journaling, exercise, can any of that be done in their seat? Thinking leg bands, seat cushions, pedals, fidgets. You know, the goal is to be able to stay in the classroom. For individuals that are going to require some type and form of movement, can we provide that in the classroom that keeps them in there to still be present and engaged with the ability that they have in that moment? Different planned breaks. Are there times that might be a good opportunity for an individual to get a break where maybe they're not going to miss a whole bulk of information, or something that won't be very detrimental to their learning, but is a good opportunity to give them that movement that they seem to frequently need? And is there a way to do that where individuals feel supportive? Are they helpful in some way? Do they have a job or a task? I think a lot of times individuals can feel a sense of helpful or supportive, or a sense of pride for having to be needed for something. So how can we kind of meet both of those things in the middle and be a little bit strength-based with that? In sensory integration, this one I'll be a big proponent of, really incorporating sensory into the classroom. Different varieties of sensory awareness to be able to support individuals that have different needs. And then just making sure different coping skills are accessible. Are there things that individuals have to be able to access to use to hopefully be able to support some of the things that are going on in their bodies in those moments? When they don't have tools to use, that's when we start to see some of those different types of behavior and different types of responses. And then our next slide here, and this is going to wrap us up before I'll kind of finalize and close up building communities of care and open it up for questions, is just age group considerations. So this is building communities of care. The whole goal of it is meant to adapt specifically to the needs of who you're working with. So this is a systems-based training where we're going to incorporate a lot of the systems that you have, and how do we continue to support those, while incorporating some of that trauma-informed approach in there as well. So things that we want to think about for different age groups is, again, stage, not age. And what does that look like for individuals that you're working with? How may that present itself, and how should we kind of shift to intervene and respond when that does present itself? The language that we use, how are we framing this? That's going to look very different for a 4, 5, 6-year-old than it does for a 16, 17, or 18-year-old at times. Other times, things may look similar in certain areas as well. Different learning or communication styles. These are ways that we can be flexible and meet specific needs that you all have. Really thinking about safety and what that looks like in the context of your school, age, and population. Imminent risk, how to identify that. It's a very tough thing to be able to train and talk about, because that's going to look different, not only for each individual that you're working with, but also each staff that's working with those individuals is probably going to identify that a little bit differently. So how do we develop some sort of unified definition for that, to be able to label that in a way that staff and students feel safe? And the last one, really thinking about latency youth, or all youth in general, different visual aids, sometimes less words, different incentives, ways to have individuals hopefully buy in and gain access to certain types of programming, or want to buy into different things that we're doing. Those are things that have definitely been able to be helpful. So that's going to bring me to my last slide. So I'll leave this up here for a second. If anybody would like to take my email or anything like that, feel free. So just kind of a little bit more about building communities of care, just to kind of summarize it. So typically the building communities of care training curriculum is delivered in 16 to 24 hours of training. The 16-hour training really focuses on environment, treatment, engagement in depth, and the 24-hour training would be for self-protection, physical intervention, and those aspects as well, if that was so needed at a certain place. We also take building communities of care and break that down into much more digestible professional development workshops or really targeted trainings around things such as attunement, creating a trauma-informed environment, de-escalation through verbal or nonverbal activities, and really pulling these into like 2-hour workshops that really focus and kind of hone in on a specific target area of BCC to help support and address and provide some training around. With that said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm just going to ask if there are any questions from anyone in the group, any thoughts, feedback that anybody wanted to share. That's okay. There's usually never any questions, but I'll still give people one quick second. If not, it sounds like I'm going to be transitioning off in a minute or so. And I believe people have one more session, so it might give you a minute or two to grab a little bit of water or a snack if you need.
Corey, I wanted to thank you so much. That was just a tremendous presentation, and I really respect the work that you're doing. And I think it was a real asset for everyone to get that information today. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you for the positive comments in the chat box. I appreciate that a lot. Thank you everyone for having me today. And I look forward to hopefully hearing from you and talking from some of you in the future.
Great. Thank you, Corey. So I think I'll just give us 2 minutes to take a standing moment or get a glass of water or whatever anyone needs to do. And I'll meet back in 2 minutes to introduce Connie. Thank you.
Stephanie, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can see your screen. Thank you, Connie.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find my presentation view now.
Good. We have a couple minutes. Take your time.
I wonder where it went. That's so odd. Okay. That's not what we wanted. I'm going to stop sharing for a second.
Slideshow, then it should help.
Oh, there's the tab. I just had to drag the tab to my other screen, so I think we're good now. There we go. Okay, now you can see it, right?
Yes, we can definitely see it. Thank you so much. I'll wait 1 more minute and then we'll get started.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, we will move on to our last presentation for the breakout room today, which is Connie's, and I'm so glad to have her present to us today. Connie is a highly experienced speech language pathologist and educational consultant and the founder of Supportable Solutions. She has 20 plus years of experience in educational settings and holds a certificate in instructional coaching, positive education, applied educational neuroscience, and the polyvagal theory. She served as a member of the multi-state work group to help develop the Common Core Essential Elements for English Language Arts. Connie is a published writer for Autism Parenting Magazine, writes for Exceptional Needs Today, and is a guest blogger for the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. Connie created the Y Toolkit, an innovative process to assess student behavior, which deviates from the traditional behaviorism approach and aligns with current relational and neuroscience while maintaining a trauma-sensitive and neurodiversity approach. Connie works from the guiding mission that connection and collaboration equals endless possibilities. Welcome, Connie.
Thank you, Stephanie. Today's been such a great day. I'm so honored to be here. I hope you guys will find my session to be helpful for moving away from the use of timeout rooms. Here in Wisconsin, we do not have timeout rooms, but we definitely have the practice of seclusion. And so I have, have some data, not a lot, but I have some data from the toolkit, which is what we're going to be talking about today. I do want to start by giving you just if I can make my slides move, a quick snapshot of what we're going to be speaking about today, or what I'm going to be talking to you about today. And I do want to make sure that we get questions answered if you have them. So feel free to, Stephanie already knows to monitor the chat for me. Feel free to throw questions in the chat if you have some, because I'd much rather get your questions answered than get through my content. But I started my business, Supportable Solutions, about 11 years ago, but and I didn't really think that as I started my practice, people would be asking me to conduct functional behavioral assessments. And about 15 years ago, Wisconsin had a contract with Dr. Ross Green, and I was learning more about, his philosophy. And then I started really learning more about the brain. And as Guy Stevens mentioned this morning, that we've just had so much more knowledge and brain science and neuroscience in the educational field. And I was really struggling with how to mesh that into functional behavioral assessments. And when districts started calling me, asking me to help them assess student behaviors, I was really struggling with aligning my practice and aligning what I do with traditional functional behavioral assessments, which basically set me out on this mission over the last probably 10 years of, trying to create a system and a process that I could use to assess student behavior that brought in what we currently know about the brain, about the autonomic nervous system, about the philosophy that kids do well if they can. It was very important to me to be trauma sensitive and to be neurodiversity affirming. In around 2019, I started more and more listening to the lived experiences of autistic adults and neurodivergent adults that were really speaking out against behaviorism and the impacts that had had on their life. And I did not at all want to be a part of that. I always thought I was more neurodiversity affirming than most, but I really set out on an intentional mission to make sure that I was never causing that kind of harm on somebody or sending a message that they were broken and needed to be fixed. So that kind of led to this accumulation of the Y Toolkit, which is now currently in software. It's like an online form that you can use. You purchase student accounts, you have access to the Y Toolkit, which includes an assessment, a support plan, and we're going to go through kind of briefly what all that kind of involves today. But even above and beyond that, if you don't choose to utilize the assessment that I've created, I'm hoping that you can take away some of the things that we talk about today and start embedding things into your own assessments that you're using on your students. Because I think some of this that I'm talking about today can absolutely be embedded into whatever system your district has currently. So I do have some data on evidence of how well this has been impactful to students and staff, actually, in school districts. I had a school district piloting the Y Toolkit for a year, and in 1 year, they showed a decrease of 21% in their seclusion and restraint numbers. Now, I will say very upfront in that they had small numbers to begin with of seclusion and restraint. And so I do think in a larger district with more, well, they're a pretty large district, but in a district that had more numbers of seclusion and restraint to begin with, we might even see a bigger decrease. So if you are a district that wants to think outside the box and really try something new to decrease your use of timeout rooms or seclusion or restraint, please contact me, because I am, and you'll have my number at the end of the presentation, or my contact information, but I am looking for districts to pair with to collect some more data as well. Okay, so what we're going to cover today is we're going to briefly, and Guy did such a great job this morning of talking about behaviorism, that I'm going to go through this briefly because we only have 55 minutes, but we're going to talk about, looking backwards to move forward. I know that when I started on my mission of revamping what I was always doing, I was really surprised to learn, how old some of the concepts were that our traditional functional behavioral assessments were based upon. And so I want to start with that. I want to start with what's the impact of doing things the way we've always done. And then I want to move into some major shifts that we need to do to align practice with our current knowledge, because we have really learned a lot over the last 100 years, which is what you will learn. Traditional behavioral assessments and behavior intervention plans are rooted in behaviorism and applied behavior analysis, which can trace back all the way to the 1930s. It's almost 100 years old. Based off the work of B.F. Skinner, behaviors were defined as observable responses to things that were happening in our environment, to external stimuli. And there was a theory, or there is the theory, that behaviors were simple stimuli responses and simple reactions that can be changed through operant conditioning, which is really a type of learning that's an association between the behavior and the consequence for that behavior. So, that's where rewards and punishment comes into place, or positive reinforcement and in negative punishment and negative reinforcement. So, and I'm not going to get into all of that because I think Guy talked pretty nicely about that today in his keynote. But really, when you look at the traditional assessments that we do on behavior, there's this belief that behavior is intentful, that the behavior is done because it's being reinforced by either positive or negative reinforcement, and it's working for the child to either attain something or escape something, to attain, attention, to escape or avoid something, to seek out a tangible item or activity. And autonomic reinforcement, which kind of has evolved over the years as sensory reinforcement, but that automatically or something is happening in the environment to help that student's sensory system. And then in the 80s came out this need for control as a major function also. But really, if you look at the majority of the traditional functional behavioral assessments, they'll have those first 4 functions most, which really sends a message. And I worked very, very hard when I was creating the toolkit to think about the language that I was using, because the language that we use shapes how we think about things. And so if we're talking about the functions of the behavior working for a student, that leads to this belief of intent. And as Corey was talking to us about previously, the stress response is not intentful. It is not, this top-down behavior that happens. It is bottom-up behavior that's instinctual and it's autonomic, and there's no conscious thought or cognitive thinking involved in that. And in most cases, especially in our young students, but in most cases, that's what we're seeing in our students today. So there's this big push for those in the field kind of to just end anything that has to do with behaviorism. And so there's a big push to just get rid of functional behavioral assessments. However, we can't do that because it is tied to IDEA requirements. And many times there's state laws that are required for functional behavioral assessments as well. And so as I was rolling out the toolkit, I did a lot of research across the nation, because my goal is to hopefully replace traditional practices with a more updated version of of an assessment and a support plan. So I had to know the state laws. That's one of the reasons I couldn't get rid of functions of behavior, because some states actually require that we find the function of a behavior. But under IDEA, if we're suspecting that somebody has a disability, a student has a disability, we have to do a comprehensive evaluation. And that comprehensive evaluation has to include all areas of disability, including behavior. So if an area of the disability you're suspecting has to do with that student's behavior, you should be assessing behavior in your evaluation. And a good functional behavioral assessment can do that for us. And then when it comes to manifestation determination, or if a student's behavior has had so many suspensions in a year that the change of placement is being considered, they have to go to manifestation determination. And at that point, if a functional behavioral assessment hasn't been conducted, it needs to be conducted. So it's tied to our IDEA. And then state laws, like for instance, Wisconsin, where I'm from, after the second time of using restraint or seclusion within the same school year, we have to initiate an IEP. We have to add positive behavioral supports. And those positive behavioral supports have to be based upon a current functional behavioral assessment, or a functional behavioral assessment based on the behavior that led to the seclusion and restraint. So, and then, we heard today all the challenges that schools are facing. We have a shortage of staff nationwide. The behaviors we're seeing in students are more frequent and bigger than they have been in the past. And so some of these experts who want to get rid of functional behavioral assessments altogether, really believe that we should be able to meet the needs of all students at all times. And if we do that, we won't need a functional behavioral assessment, which I wholeheartedly agree with, but I just don't think at the state that we're in right now in education that that's possible. We have too many shortages. We have too many staff, especially our special ed staff, in positions where they haven't been certified yet. They're on emergency license. And so a really good assessment can help us gather the information we need to help us better support our students and our staff. It's not just about supporting students, but it's also about supporting what our staff as well. So really, anytime behavior becomes regular, starts happening on a regular basis, or is interfering with the learning of the student or the learning of others, a good assessment should be conducted if the team is trying to better understand the student's behavior. So that can help us find out what supports our students need, what accommodations or modifications they might need, interventions that they may need to help address the behaviors. When done correctly, it can also help staff have a deeper understanding of what might be getting in the student's way. And when we have understanding, then we have more compassion, more empathy, and more patience. So I really do passionately believe that a good assessment drives everything going forward. We need to get to the root causes of what's causing the behavior and help the team understand what those are. Okay, so in a quick summary, looking back, we want to move away from behaviorism, move away from compliance-driven models. One of the most dangerous things, I think, when it comes to compliance-driven models is that it teaches our students to ignore what their body is telling them so that they can please the person in power or please the person with the reinforcer or the reward. Which over time can be very, very damaging for our students. We have to, I sometimes wonder, my daughter is so good at noticing her internal body sensations and attributing those to meaning, feelings and bodily states and what she needs, which really is interoception and the foundation of self-regulation. We have learned within the last couple of years that that's the skill needed to eventually be able to self-regulate. But these compliance-driven models are teaching our students to ignore what their body is telling them so that they can please another person. For instance, if we have an autistic student who needs to rock to be able to focus, their body is telling them they need movement to focus, yet the rule in class is that you have to sit still, hands in your lap, crisscross applesauce, eyes on me, during circle time or during rug time. And that is going against what their body is telling them they need. And oftentimes that promotes masking. My own daughter, who has some medical conditions, she is more likely to faint if she overheats. Yet the rule at school was if you put your jacket on to go out for recess, your jacket has to stay on when you go out for recess. Now think about the message that sends our students. And it's not intentional. It's not an intentional message that we're not intentionally trying to tell students to ignore their body. We don't even think about this. But, my daughter goes outside, she starts to feel hot. She wants to take off her coat, but she's a rule follower, does not want to break the rules, and therefore she keeps her coat on. So we had to write it in an accommodation of her 504 plan to be able to take her jacket off when she gets hot outside, which in reality should just be something that all of our students should do. So sometimes I think, goodness, did we all trust our internal instincts and our gut instincts and what our body was telling us initially? And has the school system kind of sent this message to not listen to that? And that's why we have so many adults now unable to notice those sensations and really attribute those to how they're feeling and make meaning out of them. So that's my biggest concern around compliance-driven models. But overall, we really want to move away from this goal of compliance and move towards self-discipline. We want to teach our students what they need to be able to focus, what they need to be able to learn, what their body is telling them they need that helps them focus, what distracts them away from focusing. We want our students to develop self-discipline versus compliance. I have a very strong-willed daughter, and I'm always telling my husband, these are things that we want our adults to have. It may not be super fun parenting a child who's not, she tells you tell her to do something and she questions you. But as an adult, that's a great skill to have. And that's the kind of children we want to raise. We want to raise children that, I oftentimes hear this quote that when compliance becomes the rule and the goal, we have these adults that become doormats. And that's not something we want for our children of today. We want to help them develop self-discipline versus, blind compliance. Of course, we want them to follow rules, but if something doesn't feel right and if it goes against their gut instinct, we want them to be able to question that and ask questions and collaborate with the person and learn negotiating skills. Those are all great skills to have as an adult. Okay, so the impact of all of this, why is this all important? Because our explanation and what we think about is causing the behavior is directly linked to the intervention that we're going to provide. How we respond to behaviors depends on what we think is causing it. And this circle that I've created is based on the Pygmalion effect with some neuroscience included and some other more recent research, but it all starts with our beliefs, what the staff believe, what their behavioral philosophy is, and then it leads into our expectations of our students. And what the Pygmalion effect told us was, if we expect a certain thing from our students, we change the way we act with them, not purposely, but indirectly. That impacts how we treat our students. It also changes how we perceive the behavior. It changes the language we use about the behavior. If we think the behavior is intentional and top down, that's going to make us use words like manipulative and they're just trying to get away with something. They're violent. Versus if we think things are neurologically wired to survive, the behaviors we're seeing are a stress response, that's going to drastically change the type of language we're using. And Lara Brodinsky, I always say her name wrong, has done a lot of research that tells us the language we use impacts the way we think about things. That's why I'm so careful about the language that I use when I'm talking about any students, but because that impacts how I think about that student and how other people think about that student. We know that our thoughts can lead to our feelings, can lead to our autonomic nervous system states, which Corey was talking to us about, those stress response states and our calm state. And our thoughts are directly linked to what pathway we move into, which ultimately leads to our response, our students' experience, our students' view of themselves, their thoughts, their feelings, their nervous system states, and ultimately their actions. So I think one of the speakers, I think it was Michael on the panel, he talked about how behavior does not occur in a vacuum. Absolutely, it's this connected experience between staff and students, and we need to be looking at how we show up for our students and whether or not we're helping the situation and calming the situation down and de-escalating, or if we're escalating everything. And a lot of this goes back to our belief and our philosophy. If we can reframe the way we think about student behavior, that will help us stay regulated. That will help us be able to show up with compassion and empathy. If I think somebody is doing something because of a stress response, that helps me stay regulated. That helps me show up with empathy and compassion and concern and care. Where vice versa, if I think a student is doing something intentionally to like push my buttons or get under my skin or intentionally get away with something, I'm going to show up much more frustrated to that situation and to that student. So this is kind of a summary of what I just said. Traditional approaches to functional behavioral assessments, FBAs, and behavior intervention plans, BIPs, for those of you that don't know what those acronyms stand for, but they start with this belief that the behavior is working for the student, that the behavior is intentional. That leads to a decreased understanding and patience from adults. It leads to interventions. We heard this reference today when Emily was talking, but planned ignoring, withholding attention, rewards and incentives for compliance, punishment for noncompliance, and incentives for desired behavior, which ultimately leads to strained relationships, frustrated adults, and all of our emotions are contagious. So if we have frustrated adults, we're going to have frustrated and stressed out students as well. And the research is so strong about how important relationships are between students and staff, that the last thing we want are strained relationships. Okay, so that was my brief summary of where we've been and why why it matters on how we think about behavior. So if not, some of these things that I've mentioned, rewards, clip charts, restraint and seclusion, timeout rooms, punishment, planned ignoring, we don't want to be compliance training anymore, neurotypical expectations, we really want to move away from that. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that and when I'm briefly talking about the toolkit. But if not this, then what can we do? Which I have really worked hard to embed all of these present behavioral approaches into the toolkit. So definitely we want to be more strength-based. There's so much research to support that all of us, no matter if you have a disability or not, or you're struggling with behavior or not, but all of us grow more in our strength areas than we do in our weaknesses. There's a lot of research about how the positive emotions in a certain location lead you to enter that location with a more regulated state, which again, I find almost humorous that we need research, because if you think about, if you went to a dentist and had a really negative experience and you have negative memories tied to that location, you're more likely to go to that environment, go back to that dentist again, more dysregulated. So by embedding strengths and passions and high interest into our students' day, we can help create more positive memories to that location, which is going to lead to them becoming more regulated in that environment. Success also breeds success. They've done a lot of research on, some of the most successful people in the world. Like, are they just lucky or what is this? But what happens when you experience a success, dopamine is released in your brain and you're more likely to want to do that same things you've done again to get that same result. So if we can build success into our students' day, we can help create more and more success. Success kind of breeds success creates more success, basically. And then by embedding, there's been a lot of research to show that embedding interests and passions into into our day increases our dopamine and increases endorphins in our brain, which both help us make us feel more calm. All of these are helping develop those neurological pathways in our brain to that parasympathetic nervous system, so that a good way to remember that is that peace pathway. They both start with a P. But we want to build the neurological pathways to calm. We want that to become a stronger pathway in our students' brains than the pathway to fight, flight, and freeze, the stress response pathway. The more these pathways are activated, the stronger they become and the more likely they are to be activated. And so if we can embed strengths and passions and interests into our students' day, then we can definitely help strengthen that neurological pathway of calm. We also want to make sure that we're really relationship driven. We have to understand the power that relationships have. Oftentimes, our students find safety within relationships. And if we can help them feel safe, we can help keep them in that parasympathetic nervous system pathway, that safe and secure pathway. Our nervous system is shaped and regulated through our interaction with each other. I mean, think about as when we're a baby, we cry. A caring, attuned adult, responds to us and helps us develop our ability to self-regulate over multiple opportunities of co-regulation. So we really want to make sure that we are evaluating how many relationships our students have in the schools and in their home community. And do we have to provide some really explicit interventions to help build upon those relationships? Because relationships are the foundation to so much for our students. And even John Hattie's research shows that a strong, positive teacher relationship impacts our students' learning. Has a very positive impact on learning. And actually being disliked by your teacher or having a weak relationship with your teacher is one of the only things that have a negative impact on our learning. And so it's a really important thing to be looking at and thinking about and assessing, actually intentfully assessing when we're looking at our students who are struggling with behavior. And then we want to be neuroscience aligned. I think I've talked about this a little bit, but we've learned so much more about the brain, realizing that most of the behaviors we're seeing in our students are bottom-up behaviors. They're these unintentional stress responses that happen when stress piles up too much, or when a trigger occurs that activates that response, that stress response. There's no conscious thought involved in that. And we have to teach people that and help them understand that, because if they can understand it from that perspective, they're going to show up in a much more empathetic and compassionate way. And then we want to make sure that we're really being trauma sensitive. We're understanding what happens to the brain and the changes that occur in the brain, and understanding that the more that fight, flight, freeze, those stress response pathways are activated, the stronger that pathway becomes in somebody's brain, and the easier it is to activate. So once that stress response is activated, our goal shifts to just calming the student down. And I know that can be really hard for people to understand. And oftentimes they're afraid that they're going to be reinforcing the behavior. But the only goal at that point is to de-escalate the situation and bring them back to safe and secure or calm, their calm state. So we also have to understand that the changes in the brain, and Emily talked about this, can cause many of our students to be hypervigilant and to be more on alert for danger, and to have that stress response system activate easier. And we have to realize that many of our neurodivergent individuals have experienced trauma just from going through the world that's not adapted or modified for them, or understanding of their needs. And there's been some really recent research that has shared that the amygdala, that place in the brain that activates the fight-flight response, is larger in students with autism and individuals with ADHD, with obsessive compulsive disorder, and that many autistic individuals have brains that are similar to people with post-traumatic stress syndrome. They actually have a 33% higher chance of being diagnosed with post-PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. And so Oftentimes that just comes along with being neurodivergent. They have sensory trauma, they have communication trauma, they have cognitive trauma, and we have to be able to have that awareness and understanding. And then lastly, we really want to make sure we're neurodiversity affirming, that we're, stop sending this message that somebody has to change, that they're not, that they're broken, that we need to fix them, and instead start welcoming and understanding some neurodivergent needs and neurodiversity. And I'll talk a little bit more in depth about that as we talk further, but moving away from even the language of finding a replacement behavior, that I'm going to write an article on that soon because that triggers me. Just that statement is triggering for me because it automatically assumes that we have to have the student change instead of the environment potentially changing. Or I don't know, maybe we need to change our expectations. Maybe our expectations are only based on neurotypical expectations and social norms, and we need to be more accepting and welcoming to our individuals with brains that are wired differently. And so we need to be thinking more in terms of neurodiversity affirming as well when we're doing these assessments and support plans. So I'm going to go through some shifts that are needed in our practice, and I'm going to talk specifically about the toolkit, but also in general terms. Please know that you can implement some of this language, you can make some of these changes without, using the software or using the tool as well. Okay, so the first thing, one of the biggest goals with the Why Toolkit for me is that we are rethinking, reframing, and reimagining the way we look at students' behavior and how we can support that. So as you go through the toolkit, there's all sorts of quotes from some of the leading authors. There's images to help staff really understand and think differently about behavior, because the longer I was doing these assessments, the more I realized, goodness, there's not all that much time to train people to think differently about behaviors. And so I tried to embed things that would really make quotes and sayings and phrases to really make people, and images to make people think about things in a different way. That's why I was so intentional about my language choice as well. I had several sensitivity readers read through everything to make sure that the language was not offensive to, people who've had functional behavioral assessments conducted on them, parents who have been a part of those programs, neurodivergent, or a part of those assessments, neurodivergent individuals, because again, the language we use shapes how we think about it. So right away, when we first start the assessment, my big goal is that we change the way we think about behaviors, and we come to understand that the behaviors are a manifestation of excessive stress. And with that, we actually help calm ourselves by having that thought. And then it helps us also offer support that students need with empathy and compassion versus with frustration. Dr. Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson talk about that a lot in their book, No Drama Discipline. Like, if we can think about behavior differently, we can show up for our students in a very different way. We're not as frustrated when we think about it. So I want you guys just to take maybe 30 seconds to reflect on that. And right away in the assessment, when people are in the toolkit, that question pops up: how can this understanding help shape the approach to today's assessment and support planning? So I just want to give you 30 seconds to think about that quote from me and reflect on this insight. Okay, so within the toolkit, there's the assessment, which is my replacement to a traditional functional behavioral assessment, and I call that Finding the Why. And again, an assessment is really so important to help us understand and explain the behaviors to others, because that's going to guide everything we do. It's going to guide the interventions we provide. It's going to guide the supports we provide, and it's going to shape the responses of others. And so it starts with a really thorough assessment. I've moved away from, you heard some of the panel members today talking about the behavior of concern. That's a very traditional phrase. from behaviorism research. And I've moved away from the target behavior of concern or the behavior of concern and moved instead to describing a student's behavior as a wave of distress that they go through. And I've done this for a couple of reasons. I've never assessed a student who just has one behavior. So oftentimes when that question comes up, what's the behavior of concern or what's the target of behavior of concern, we're at like a standstill from the get-go, and that leads to some conflict between staff members and discussing which one should be priority. And then I've had some medical professionals and practitioners say, well, we need to have an assessment for every behavior. And I'm like, whoa, have you ever taught in a classroom? Because it's really hard to follow an individualized plan for one child, let alone 2 plans for each children for one child. So I've moved instead towards this wave of distress. It also helps people understand from a neurological point of view, from a neuroscience aligned lens, what is actually truly happening to our students. So they're safe, they're secure. This is when there's been no trigger. They're in that parasympathetic pathway. They're, maybe they're focused. They're able to have a conversation back and forth with each other. And then something in the environment triggers them, or something internally. This can be internal sensations also. It's a trigger and activates this wave of distress for that student. And then I break that down into unease, disconnection, protection. That's when we start thinking about those autonomic nervous system pathways of survival, fight, flight, or freeze. Then the student goes through rest and restore and recovery. When this happens, the thinking brain, as soon as that trigger occurs, that thinking brain starts to go offline. And as you go further and further through the peak of the wave, your feeling brain starts to take over and you lose the ability to access your thinking brain. And I really want to make sure that everybody understands that, because oftentimes when we have escalated students, we're trying to rationalize with them. We're trying to, threaten consequences and talk to them about, the impact of their behavior on others and what that's going to lead to. And they're not able to process that information at that point in time, which only leads to further escalation. And so, to break that down a little bit, just give you a few examples. Unease might be rocking. It might be those subtle, low-level behaviors that happen before things get really big. And that's the other reason I try to break it down this way, is because if we can catch it early, we can have the most impact, because the thinking brain is most accessible after the trigger in unease. And so if we can teach the staff that are supporting that student what that child looks like when those low-level signals are happening, we can provide supports and offer de-escalation strategies right then, and we'll have the biggest impact at that point in time. This is by far what regular education teachers have appreciated most. I've been using this tool now probably for 8 years on my own, and staff, above and beyond anything else, love this wave of distress because it helps them map out what the student looks like. And then when we get to the behavior intervention planning portion, we can specifically say what kind of de-escalation tools staff need to provide students at each one of these phases of the wave to help de-escalate the situation. So they finally feel like, oh, I know what I need to do when a student becomes triggered and how to help them calm down. So again, unease might be rocking. It might be the tips of their ears turning red. Their volume or their pitch might get higher. When it moves to disconnection, things start to progress. You might see some refusal here, or what we might want to call non-compliance. A student might fall to the ground. They might break their pencil, pound on their desk. And then when we get to that peak of the wave, that's going to be when either fight, flight, or freeze kicks in. And this whole wave is going to be very individualized based on the student. When you're doing your assessment, you're doing multiple observations to kind of map out what the student looks like. And oftentimes that takes a different observer. We can't expect our classroom teachers to notice all this because they're busy teaching an entire class. So oftentimes if I'm coming in to do an assessment, this is what I'm looking for and watching. And so, perhaps in fight, that student might become aggressive. They might throw something at someone. If they move into the flight pathway, they might run out of the room. That might be when elopement happens. Freeze, they might, shut down and put their hood up and, become non-responsive. I've had several kids that just stop talking at this point and are unable to respond to people. And then we map out how they look as their body starts to rest and restore. We start to see a decrease in movement, in behaviors. Maybe they start humming. Oftentimes humming is one behavior we see a lot here. Rocking again, engaging in sensory activities. In recover, maybe they sleep if they're really tired, because this has been a really taxing process that their body has gone through. Perhaps they need to start crying and release some of that. That's all going to be very individualized based on the student. And we're going to want to use our assessment to really map out how that looks. Okay, and then the next part of the assessment is really taking a deep dive into a root cause analysis. We don't want to focus only on what we see, as we don't want to just focus on the observable behaviors, because that's just, as Mona would say, that's the tip of the iceberg. We want to dig deeper and look at the root cause of the behaviors. So we're going to start assessing stressors, and I'm going to just pull up the next slide because that's got the definitions on there. But we're going to look at stressors. What are the people, the activities, the environmental stimuli that cause a student's window of tolerance to kind of decrease or shrink? And we want to make sure that we list all those for the staff members so that we can start supporting them. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we support those. And then triggers are people, events, environments, sensations, thoughts. It could be anxiety that or a worry that activate that wave of distress in our students. And again, we want to use our assessment and interview staff, observe the student, go through records to really get a good list of what their triggers are and what their stressors are. And then we also want to look at the environment, and we want to make sure that we have a neuro-inclusive environment. Are there unmet needs in that environment that potentially are leading to some behaviors for that student? Maybe they're really sensitive to sound and the environment is really loud. Maybe they process things visually, yet they don't have visual supports in their environment. Or they're in a middle school classroom that's traditional lecture based and there's not much visuals for them to fall back on. So as we're assessing our students, we want to be looking at that. Is the environment set up based on neurotypical expectations that, really in this day and age aren't very conducive to the needs of our students any longer? Right now, they're predicting 1 in 4 kids are coming to us with trauma. 1 in 5 kids are estimated to be neurodivergent. So when you think about that in an average classroom, that's about half your class is very neurodivergent, and their brains are wired differently than what we would consider neurotypical. And then throw on their cultural diversity and racial diversity and, just differences from that perspective. We really need to be creating environments that are meeting the needs of all of our learners. And so that's going to be a big part of this assessment. And then we're going to also be looking at the developing skills of that student. Are there skills that they're still developing that are not yet fully mastered that could be contributing to some behaviors? And I'm not making a list of these so that I am going to tell the parents and the student what they want to fix, what they need to fix, but we're going to have a conversation together collaboratively about where that student wants to grow and what that family's priority is around some of their skills that are still developing. And then we'll talk about functions, so I will get there, but also a big piece of the big difference in the Y toolkit is that we're looking at the adult's response to behaviors. Traditionally, you would look at the consequences that happen right after the behavior. And instead, I want to be making sure that we're looking at how the adults are responding, and we're really tracking that data to determine if is the way the adult responding escalating the situation or de-escalating the situation? Because when it comes to the behavior support plan, we want to make sure that we're using those strategies that de-escalate the situation, not the strategies that escalate the situation. So we need to be tracking that in our assessment. And oftentimes I tell staff, like, no judgment. I'm just going to be tracking exactly, are we suspending? Are we restraining? Are we removing them from the environment? Are we providing extra supports? Because maybe if we're providing a visual after the behavior, we could instead flip that and start providing that proactively instead. But we want to be tracking all that and looking at what's calming the student versus what's escalating the student. And then we want to make sure that when we plan, that we're planning for those responses that calm the student once that wave of distress has been activated. And then when it comes to functions, I'm going to talk to you a lot about how I've changed that. And I've changed that in a sense that really digs a layer deeper, is how I like to describe it. The student might still be escaping, but we're going to change the language to go a level deeper as to why they're trying to escape or avoid. And with that, I think the biggest change I've seen from changing the language is it gives the staff hope and it gives them something to do. It helps them understand that they have more within their control than perhaps they thought they did. So for example, when it comes to escape, instead of just saying they're trying to escape or avoid, I would say, they're having adaptive responses to demands exceeding their abilities. So for example, I had a team that just continually said, he won't write, he won't write, he won't write. And I kept trying to find, why won't he write? And they're like, he just won't. And that staff was so frustrated. They were so hopeless. I really felt it was really a huge aha moment for me, because I stood back watching them thinking, well, no wonder why so many people are fleeing our field today if this is the way they feel, because that's a really hopeless feeling. And for those of you in the mental health field, the longer you feel hopeless, the more likely that is to lead to anxiety and depression, that thought pattern that you have no control over the situation. And in this sense, it wasn't really the reality. There were reasons that child couldn't write. They had skills that they didn't have fully developed yet. And so when we got curious and really dug deep and tried to find what part of that skill was hard for that student, that opened up a whole world of possibilities for the teachers on what they could provide and what interventions and supports they could provide, which felt a lot more hopeful for them. So really moving away, and as Dr. Stuart Schager says, really seeing a different child, see a child differently, you see a different child. It really helps you look at things in a very different light if you change the way you're viewing a behavior. And so instead of attention seeking, connection seeking, need for co-regulation. Maybe, I've had students that oftentimes will seek out somebody in the main office, and staff continually say they're attention seeking, but I know that that's the relationship that they have a really strong relationship with that dean of students, and they're using that person to help them co-regulate. That's their co-regulator, and they need to find them to help them calm down. So if we know that helps us see things in a very different light, because for some reason, when we think a child is attention seeking, we think we should withhold attention from them. And so, well, that goes back to this thought process that the behavior is working for the child because it reinforces the function. And so we want to move away from thinking that way. And so changing our language can be a really impactful strategy to do that. So instead of escape, they're having adaptive responses to situations that cause distress. School avoidance is oftentimes the root cause of, that environment is too stressful for the student. And if we can think about that way, we can think about strategies we can put in place to decrease some of their stress. Maybe they're cognitively overwhelmed. I know I avoid things when the project is really big and I become cognitively overwhelmed, and if I think about it from that perspective, I know I can break down that task into smaller sections, and that's going to help me with my cognitive overwhelm. Or maybe they're perfectionistic and they have a really hard time because they know how much work it's going to be to get this project to look the way they think it should look, to be perfect. And that causes cognitive overwhelm. I already talked about the adaptive responses to demands exceeding stress. And I know a lot of experts use the word maladaptive, but again, this is just our body and our brain and our autonomic nervous system doing what it was meant to do to keep us safe and protect us from threat. I don't see that as maladaptive. I see that as adaptive. And so it's our job to help decrease that threat system for them and help put in place supports and strategies and interventions to not make it feel so threatful or stressful. My dog's going to come in. I'm sorry. She always has to interrupt my presentations at least once. Okay, and then tangible. Instead of saying that a student is using the behavior to get something, why not just saying they're using unconventional means to communicate? And so, for instance, the student who falls to the floor, they're trying to communicate refusal, but they maybe don't have the words at that moment to say that. Also, another one that I see oftentimes is just not that being able to have the words to express disappointment. Maybe their timer went off and they're done with their iPad, but they love the iPad and they just don't have the language or the ability to share, oh, I'm really bummed. I was really enjoying this game. Or I'm not in a spot that feels right for me to stop. Can I have 2 more minutes? I just need to stop. We're in a place that makes sense to me. And that's negotiation type skills that oftentimes we teach our neurotypical children to do that. But I've watched, and my twin sister has a foster child with a label of ADHD. And she said, wow, it's really interesting how that child isn't able to negotiate, but my neurotypical child can negotiate all the time. Sometimes we forget to even give them that opportunity to practice that skill. And so negotiation is another communication technique that I've seen oftentimes that can lead to behaviors because they don't have that skill fully developed yet. And then instead of saying sensory reinforcement, like being much more explicit and saying maybe they're having sensory dysregulation, maybe they have a sensitive stress response. I know I have a sensitive stress response. I move into fight flight very easily. And so when you have a sensitive stress response, that system is going to be activated more easily than somebody who doesn't have a stress response that's overly sensitive. Maybe they have sensory and emotional overwhelm. I've had students who just any strong feeling, even if it's the positive ones, like happiness, if it's too big and too strong, they feel overwhelmed by that, and that triggers that response to have that wave of distress. Wave of stress isn't always bad. Stress can be good stress too, that activates that wave of distress also. And then this hypervigilant neuroception of threat. Dr. Stephen Porges talks about neuroception as our brain and body's constant scanning of the environment to answer the question, am I safe or am I under threat? It's always happening at a subconscious level for us. That's what our brain is meant to do to keep us safe. And so oftentimes our students who've experienced trauma have this mismatch neuroception or this hypervigilant neuroception. They've been rewired to be on alert for danger. And so that might activate in times where actually they're safe, or a memory or a sensory information triggers that response in them because of their past experiences. So that could be the underlying reason why we're seeing some behaviors. Okay, now I just looked at the clock and I have 8 minutes. So beyond the why is the behavior support plan portion. And this is all about being proactive and providing proactive supports. And so we're really focusing on the items to the left of the wave. Some of those stressors and responses to behaviors that escalate the situation, unsupported neuro-inclusive needs. We're making sure that our environment is meeting the needs of all of the student that we're assessing and all brain types, hopefully. And so we're going to talk about a lot of proactive supports. When it comes to stressors and triggers, I just have this little checklist that we can go through, like maybe to help deal with stress. Sometimes we can't remove stressors. Sometimes they're out of our control. A stressor for me might be my migraines. You know, if I have a migraine, my window of tolerance is going to decrease. It might not absolutely activate that wave of distress, but it's going to make it more likely that that's going to get activated easier. And so maybe I just need to increase protective factors. I need to like make sure I'm surrounded by sensory input that doesn't irritate me. I need to make sure that the lights are dim because bright lights hurt my eyes more than other people. I just need to increase the protective factors in my environment on those days. Or maybe I can minimize and eliminate the stressor. There's some stressors we can do that for. That's not a bad thing. That's an okay thing to do for students. I think sometimes we think that's like giving in to the student, but oftentimes, remember, success breeds success. So the longer we can prevent a behavior from happening, the better. And then we can neutralize the stressor. If we know a stressor is going to come up, like let's say an assembly is a stressor for that student, we can neutralize it by giving them time right before the assembly to do something that they love, to engage in a high interest or passion activity to help neutralize that stressor a little bit. Or maybe that will come after the assembly to help neutralize it. Or we can add more supports around the stressor if we can't eliminate it or minimize it. Maybe for a student who has a hard time transitioning from mom to dad's house on Mondays, that those days we build in more breaks for that child. We increase the visual supports that we provide for that child. And we can do the same thing with triggers. We can either eliminate them, we can modify them. For some students, demands are seen as a threat. They have a really sensitive stress response system that gets activated by a demand. And so maybe we need to use a different type of language when we're communicating with that student. We might want to use declarative language that is less threatening and more inviting and less demanding to modify that content a little bit. Or we can change the presentation of the trigger so that it maybe instead of saying no, we say stop, so that we're changing the presentation of the way that looks. So those are some examples of how we can proactively support stressors and triggers. I want to talk a little bit about moving away from teaching an alternative behavior to meet the function, because I think that sends a message that somebody is broken, we need to fix them. It puts the onus of change on the student. And instead, I think we need to talk about what supports do we need to provide? Are there any developing skills that we need to teach that will help decrease some of those behaviors? Or how about this? Like, are there any neurodivergent characteristics we just need to accept and welcome? Instead of trying to change it, can we just accept and welcome it and make it okay? I had a student who had to share about the weather when it popped into his mind. That was a high interest to his. And so instead of the teacher working on teaching him the appropriate time to share that, they allowed him to just blurt out something about the weather. It might take 30 seconds for him to share that information, and then the whole class moved on. That's a way to accept and welcome neurodivergent characteristics. We don't always have to change it. The onus of change has been on the neurodivergent individual for way, way too long, and we need to change that, because over time that has a long-term impact on self-esteem, on masking and camouflaging who they are, and having to show up and not be their authentic self, which has a really big impact on their mental health. Okay, so for neuro-inclusive needs, are there adaptations, modifications, understanding, or acceptance required to allow for and welcome the students' individual differences so that we can create this neuro-inclusive environment? And we want to make sure we list those out so that those are proactively provided for our students. All right, I have 3 minutes. So I think I'm going to end at this connected experience, because we also have to really think about the fact that behavior is a connected experience. What we do, how we act, how we feel impacts our students. And again, what our student does, how they feel and how they act is absolutely going to impact us too. So we need to be talking about that, thinking about that. And just having that awareness can help us with our own triggers, but it can also help us really think about how we're showing up for our students, so that once that wave of distress occurs, that we can de-escalate that situation. So we need to think about how we're showing up and show up in a way that helps calm the situation, de-escalate the student so that they can calm down and get back to that safe and secure. Okay, I'm going to put up that last screen so that you can reach me if you have any questions, if you want to find out any more information. That's my email and my website for you to have. And then if you have any questions, we have 2 minutes for questions.
Connie, that was an incredible presentation. I so appreciate your time and your insight. And I think there's so much value in what you offered. So thank you. And
Thank you for having me, Stephanie.
sure. Well, I think everyone's taking it in. There's no questions in the chat right now. So I think we'll sign off, but feel free to reach out to Connie directly. There's her contact information. All the presenters have contact information. And just as a reminder, we're going to log off this link. But if you go back to the link that you used in the morning, we're going to have a closing panel with really concrete takeaways and a sense of what's happening statewide with the organizations on this issue. So feel free to join us if you would like to get that information, and we will see you over on the other Zoom link. Thank you so much.
Stephanie, I think I sent my slides. There was a question about if the slides will be available.
So
I sent you handouts. Do I need to do anything else, or should people just email me for the handouts?
So what people are going to get is a recording of this, the full day, and that will include the recording of your slides, but not the PowerPoint version. So if they want that, I think they can reach out to you if you're willing to forward.
Absolutely. Just email me and I will send you guys the slides if you'd like them.
Great. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us, and I hope to see you over in the other Zoom link.
Thank you.